Every woman deserves to feel beautiful on her wedding day, but Martha Whitfield had been left at the altar 3 times, her dreams crushed by men who couldn't see past her size. In a world that judged worth by waist measurements, she'd become the town's forgotten soul, invisible except when folks needed someone to pity. Martha weighed 300 pounds and lived in Cedar Ridge, where most believed love was only for the pretty ones. She spent her days helping others plan their weddings, while her own heart grew heavy with loneliness. Then came Ezra Stone, a mountain man who lived alone in the wilderness, big as a bear and twice as fierce. When he saw how the town treated Martha, something inside him stirred, a protective anger that had been sleeping for years. He didn't care about society's rules or what people thought was proper. What happens when a man decides that real love has nothing to do with what others expect? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows through the dusty windows of Henderson's General Store as Martha Whitfield arranged bolts of fabric with practiced hands. At 28, she had learned to find purpose in the small tasks, folding calico, measuring ribbon, helping young brides select their trousseau. Each interaction was a reminder of what she'd never have. Yet she greeted every customer with genuine warmth. "Morning, Mrs. Patterson," Martha called to the banker's wife as she swept through the door, bringing with her the scent of lavender water and the rustle of expensive taffeta. "Oh, Martha, dear." Mrs. Patterson's voice carried that particular tone, reserved for addressing the unfortunate. "I do hope you're feeling better after Saturday's unpleasantness." Saturday's unpleasantness. As if Thomas Brennan's public rejection had been nothing more than a social hiccup, like spilling tea on a tablecloth. Martha's hands stilled on the bolt of blue wool she'd been straightening. Thomas had stood before the entire congregation and declared he couldn't marry a woman who didn't suit his station. The words still burned like brands across her memory. "I'm quite well." "Thank you," Martha replied, her voice steady despite the familiar ache in her chest. She had learned long ago that showing pain only invited more of it. Mrs. Patterson clucked her tongue sympathetically while selecting yards of ivory silk. "Perhaps it's for the best, dear. Thomas Brennan always was particular about appearances. Some men simply require, that is to say, well, you understand." Martha understood perfectly. She understood that at 300 pounds she was considered unmarriageable by Cedar Ridge standards. She understood that her mother's desperate attempts to secure her a husband had only made her situation more pitiable. She understood that being left at the altar 3 times had transformed her from a woman seeking love into a cautionary tale. Mothers whispered to their daughters. The bell above the door chimed. Again, as Sarah Mitchell hurried in, her cheeks flushed with excitement. At 19, Sarah possessed the kind of delicate beauty that made men stumble over their own feet. Tiny waist, golden curls, and eyes the color of spring violets. "Martha, oh Martha, the most wonderful thing has happened." Sarah practically danced across the worn wooden floor. "James proposed last night under the old oak tree by Miller's Creek. We're to be married in the spring." Martha's heart squeezed tight, but her smile came naturally. Sarah had always been kind to her, never joining in the cruel whispers or pointed stares that followed Martha through town. "How wonderful for you both. James is a good man. I know I shouldn't be so excited when you're—" Sarah's face fell as she realized her tactlessness. "When I'm what? Happy for a dear friend?" Martha moved around the counter to embrace the younger woman. "Love is something to celebrate, Sarah, always." As Sarah chatted about wedding plans and Mrs. Patterson offered unsolicited advice about managing husbands, Martha retreated into the familiar role of helpful spinster. She fetched pattern books, suggested color combinations, and calculated yardage with mathematical precision. It was easier than thinking about the ivory gown hanging in her own wardrobe, the dress she'd sewn with such hope for her wedding to William Thompson 2 years ago. The dress had never left her bedroom. Like her dreams, it remained unworn and gathering dust. After the women left, Martha climbed the stairs to the living quarters above the store. Her father had built these rooms for his young bride 30 years ago, never imagining his only daughter would still occupy them at 28, unmarried and likely to remain so. The space was comfortable enough, a small parlor, bedroom, and kitchen that served her simple needs. She paused before the mahogany wardrobe that had been her grandmother's, her fingers tracing the carved roses along its edges. Inside, wrapped in muslin, hung the wedding dress. Sometimes she wondered if she should sell it or give it to someone who might actually wear it. But selling it would mean accepting that hope was truly dead, and Martha wasn't quite ready for that final surrender. Instead, she moved to the window that overlooked Main Street. Cedar Ridge sprawled below her like a living map of her limitations. The church where she'd been humiliated. The hotel where wedding receptions celebrated love she'd never know. The homes of families who pitied her behind lace curtains. 20 miles beyond the town's edge, the Rocky Mountains rose like sleeping giants against the sky. Martha had heard stories about the man who lived up there. Ezra Stone, they called him. A mountain man who'd appeared 5 years ago, built himself a cabin somewhere in the high country, and rarely showed his face in town. When he did come down for supplies, he was polite but distant, conducting his business with few words and fewer smiles. The other women found him frightening. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway and hands that could span a man's head. His dark hair hung past his shoulders, and his beard was thick and untamed. But Martha had noticed something the others missed, the way he moved with careful grace, as if conscious of his size and its effect on others. The way his dark eyes held intelligence and something that looked like old pain. He'd spoken to her exactly once, 3 months ago, when he'd needed thread for mending. His voice had been surprisingly gentle, like distant thunder. "Much obliged, miss," he'd said, and she'd felt something flutter in her chest that she'd immediately dismissed as foolishness. Men like Ezra Stone didn't notice women like Martha Whitfield. No one did, really, except to whisper about her failures or offer hollow comfort. A knock at the door interrupted her brooding. Martha opened it to find her sister Elizabeth on the threshold, her pretty face tight with concern and barely contained frustration. "Martha Jane Whitfield, you cannot hide up here forever." Elizabeth swept past her into the parlor, her bustle rustling with righteous indignation. "The whole town is talking. The whole town is always talking." Martha closed the door and faced her sister's familiar lecture. Elizabeth was 5 years younger and had been married to the schoolmaster since she was 20. She possessed their mother's practical beauty and their father's stubborn streak. "Thomas Brennan was a fool to let you go," Elizabeth continued, settling her skirts with sharp movements. "But there are other men who also have eyes and preferences." Martha moved to the stove to prepare tea, needing something to do with her hands. "I'm not a charity case, Elizabeth. I won't be married out of pity." "It wouldn't be pity if you'd just—" Elizabeth stopped herself, but Martha could finish the sentence. "If you'd just lose weight. If you'd just try harder. If you'd just accept whatever man would have you." "I've tried being what others wanted," Martha said quietly, measuring tea leaves with steady hands. "I spent 2 years altering myself for William's preferences, then another year trying to become what Robert needed. Thomas wanted me to be someone else entirely. I'm tired of trying to fit into spaces that weren't made for me." Elizabeth's expression softened. "I just want you to be happy." "I know." Martha poured hot water over the tea leaves, watching them swirl and darken. "But my happiness can't depend on someone else's approval. I've learned that much." They sat in companionable silence, sipping tea and listening to the sounds of the town below. Cartwheels on dirt roads, children calling to each other, the steady rhythm of life continuing whether Martha Whitfield was part of it or not. "There's something else," Elizabeth said finally. "Mother received a letter from Aunt Clara's lawyer in Denver." Martha looked up. Aunt Clara had been their father's sister, a spinster who'd moved west 30 years ago to teach school. They'd heard she'd done well for herself, investing in land and eventually opening a boarding house, but she'd rarely corresponded with the family. "She's died, Martha. Last month. And she's left everything to you." The teacup rattled against the saucer as Martha set it down. To me, but why? The letter said she understood what it was like to be a woman alone in the world. She wanted to give you choices she never had. Elizabeth reached across to squeeze Martha's hand. It's a ranch, Martha. 300 acres, with a house and outbuildings. And enough money to live comfortably. Martha stared at her sister, hardly daring to believe it. Freedom, independence, the chance to build a life on her own terms, away from pitying stares and whispered judgments. The cross reminded him of the one that marked 2 graves in a cemetery back in Kansas. His wife Sarah and baby son Michael, taken by fever 5 years ago while he was away hunting. He'd returned to find them both cold, and something in him had died with them. The guilt had driven him west to these mountains where a man could disappear from everything that hurt. He set the half-finished cross aside and moved to the window. Below, the lights of Cedar Ridge twinkled like fallen stars. Up here, the silence was complete, except for the whisper of wind through pine boughs and the distant call of an owl. It was the peace he'd sought, but peace and contentment weren't the same thing. Sometimes he wondered if he was hiding from life instead of living it. But then he'd remember the way people looked at him when he went to town, the fear in their eyes, the way mothers pulled their children closer. He'd grown accustomed to being seen as a threat, something wild and dangerous that belonged in the mountains rather than among civilized folk. Only once had he felt differently. 3 months ago, buying thread from the quiet woman at Henderson's store. She'd looked at him without fear, her brown eyes holding something like understanding. For just a moment he'd felt almost human again. But moments like that were dangerous for a man trying to stay buried in his grief. Ezra picked up the cross again and resumed carving. Outside, the mountains kept their eternal watch, holding their secrets close. Tomorrow he would carve another cross, and another after that. Each one a prayer for forgiveness he wasn't sure he deserved. Neither Martha nor Ezra knew that their solitary lives were about to collide in ways that would change everything they thought they knew about love, worth, and the courage required to claim both. The Harvest Dance was Cedar Ridge's most anticipated social event of the year, and Martha had promised herself she wouldn't attend. Yet here she stood in the church hall's doorway, wearing her best blue dress and clutching a basket of apple tarts she'd baked for the refreshment table. Elizabeth had insisted, and Martha's resolve had crumbled under her sister's relentless persuasion. "You can't hide forever," Elizabeth had argued. "People need to see you're not broken by what happened with Thomas." But standing here now, watching couples swirl across the floor while fiddle music filled the air, Martha felt more broken than ever. The blue dress that had once fit properly now strained across her middle, a reminder that stress and sorrow had added pounds she couldn't afford to gain. She'd let out the seams twice, but fabric could only stretch so far. "Martha, how lovely that you came." Mrs. Henderson, the storekeeper's wife, appeared at her elbow with a bright smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Let me take those tarts to the dessert table. They look absolutely divine." Martha surrendered the basket gratefully, using the moment to scan the room for familiar faces. Sarah Mitchell danced with her fiancé James, radiant in rose-colored silk. The banker's daughter spun past in her beau's arms, laughing at something he whispered in her ear. Even shy Rebecca Walsh had found a partner for the evening's festivities. The fiddle slowed to a gentle waltz, and Martha retreated to a chair along the wall where the other spinsters and widows gathered. She'd been relegated to this section since her first failed engagement 3 years ago, watching life happen to other people while she remained an observer. "Such a shame about poor Martha," she heard Mrs. Patterson whisper to her companion. 3 times at the altar and still no takers. "Though I suppose we can't really blame the men, can we?" Heat flooded Martha's cheeks, but she kept her eyes fixed on the dancers. She'd learned to endure such comments, to let them wash over her like rain on stone. What choice did she have? "Perhaps if she'd take better care of herself," the other woman replied, not bothering to lower her voice. "My Harold says it's unseemly for a woman to let herself go so completely. The poor dear tries, I'm sure. But some people simply lack the discipline." "Ladies," The cold voice belonged to Thomas Brennan himself, appearing suddenly beside their chairs. Martha's stomach clenched as her former fiancé fixed his pale eyes on her. "Might I have a word with Miss Whitfield?" The gossiping women fell silent, their faces bright with curiosity. Thomas extended his hand toward Martha with the air of a man conferring a great favor. Around them, other conversations quieted as people noticed the drama unfolding. "I think not, Mr. Brennan," Martha replied quietly, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Come now, Martha. Don't be stubborn." Thomas's voice carried the patronizing tone he'd used throughout their brief engagement, as if she were a child requiring guidance. "I merely wish to apologize for any misunderstanding last week." Misunderstanding. He'd humiliated her before the entire congregation, called her unsuitable, and now he termed it a misunderstanding. Martha felt something dangerous stirring in her chest, a anger she'd kept carefully buried under layers of hurt and resignation. "There was no misunderstanding," she said, rising from her chair. "You made your position quite clear. Now see here." Thomas reached for her arm, his fingers closing around her wrist. "I'm trying to be a gentleman about this. You're causing a scene." Martha looked around the room and realized he was right. Every eye was fixed on them. Every conversation had stopped. The fiddle player had even paused mid-song, his bow hanging suspended over the strings. This was exactly what she'd feared, being the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. "Let go of me," she said, trying to pull free. "Not until you listen to reason." Thomas's grip tightened. "I spoke hastily last week. Perhaps we could reconsider our arrangement, with certain conditions, of course. Certain conditions." Martha's temper flared white-hot. She could guess what those conditions involved. Restrictions on her eating, requirements to alter her appearance, demands that she make herself smaller in every possible way to accommodate his preferences. "The only arrangement I'm interested in," Martha said clearly, her voice carrying across the silent room, "is the one where you remove your hand from my person and pretend we've never met." Thomas's face darkened. "You're being hysterical. This is precisely why no man wants to marry you. You're unreasonable and ungrateful. I'm offering you a chance at respectability despite your obvious shortcomings." The words hit Martha like physical blows. Around them, people murmured and whispered, some with pity, others with the cruel satisfaction of witnessing someone else's humiliation. She could see Sarah Mitchell's distressed face in the crowd, Elizabeth pushing through the dancers, trying to reach her. But it was too late. The damage was done. My shortcomings. Martha's voice rose despite her efforts to control it. "The only shortcoming I see is my past willingness to consider marriage to a man who mistakes cruelty for honesty." She wrenched her arm free and pushed past him toward the door, ignoring Elizabeth's calls and the whispered comments that followed her retreat. The blue dress that had felt too tight now seemed to suffocate her, and she needed air, needed to escape the stifling atmosphere of judgment and false sympathy. Outside, autumn wind cut through the thin fabric of her dress, but Martha welcomed the cold. She'd left her shawl inside, but returning for it would mean facing the crowd again, enduring more pitying looks and false concern. Instead, she turned away from the church and walked quickly down Main Street, her heels clicking against the wooden boardwalk. Behind her, she could hear the fiddle music resume, life returning to normal now that the evening's entertainment had concluded. By tomorrow, the story would be told and retold until it grew into legend. Poor Martha Whitfield, so desperate for a husband, she'd made a fool of herself at the harvest dance. The tears she'd held back began to fall as she reached the edge of town. Her carefully constructed composure crumbled, 5 years of accumulated hurt and rejection pouring out in great gasping sobs. She stumbled off the main road onto a dirt path that led toward the foothills, needing to put distance between herself and the town that had witnessed her final humiliation. The path grew rough and narrow as it climbed into the hills. Martha's dress caught on brambles, the fine wool tearing as she pushed through undergrowth without care for damage. Her soft leather shoes, meant for dancing rather than hiking, provided little protection against the rocky ground. But she pressed on, driven by a desperate need to escape everything familiar and confining. Thunder rumbled overhead, and Martha looked up to see storm clouds gathering across the peaks. She should turn back, she knew. The weather in these mountains could change without warning, and she was dressed for an evening party, not a wilderness trek. But the thought of returning to town, of facing the whispers and questions, made her stomach clench with dread. The first drops of rain began to fall as the path crested a small ridge. Below, a narrow valley stretched between pine-covered slopes, wild and beautiful in the gathering darkness. Martha had never been this far from town before, and the isolation both frightened and comforted her. Here no one could see her tears or judge her choices. The rain intensified quickly, soaking through her dress and plastering her hair to her skull. The path became treacherous, slick with mud and fallen leaves. Martha's foot slipped on a loose stone, and she went down hard, her hands scraping against rock as she tried to break her fall. Pain shot through her ankle, and when she tried to stand, her leg buckled beneath her. She was lost, hurt, and alone in a mountain storm, with night approaching fast. The reality of her situation began to penetrate through the emotional haze that had driven her up the mountain. She could die out here, and part of her wondered if that might be easier than facing tomorrow's consequences. But as she struggled to her feet, testing her injured ankle, Martha felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a strange sense of freedom. For the first time in her adult life, she was completely outside society's expectations. No one could judge her appearance or question her choices. The mountains didn't care about her size or her failed engagements. Here she was simply a human being struggling to survive. And there was a bitter honesty in that struggle. A piece of her blue skirt caught on a sharp branch as she limped forward, tearing away a long strip of fabric. She left it hanging there like a banner of rebellion and pressed on into the storm, each step taking her further from the life that had never quite fit her anyway. The wind picked up, driving the rain sideways through the trees. Martha's teeth chattered as she sought shelter beneath a large pine, but the branches provided little protection. Her ankle throbbed with each heartbeat, and exhaustion was setting in. She sank down against the tree trunk, pulling her knees to her chest in a futile attempt to conserve warmth. This was how she would die, she realized, alone in the wilderness, wearing a torn party dress, having fled from one last public humiliation. There was a certain poetic justice to it, though she doubted anyone in Cedar Ridge would see it that way. They'd probably say she'd brought it on herself through poor judgment and female hysteria. Lightning illuminated the valley in stark detail, followed immediately by a crack of thunder that seemed to shake the earth. In that brief moment of brightness, Martha thought she saw something moving through the trees below, a large shape that might have been a bear or elk. But when darkness returned, she convinced herself it had been imagination born of fear and exhaustion. The cold was seeping into her bones now, making it hard to think clearly. Her ankle had swollen until her shoe felt like a vice, and she knew she should remove it before the swelling cut off circulation entirely. But the simple act of bending forward seemed beyond her capability. Time lost all meaning as she huddled beneath the inadequate shelter of the pine tree. The storm raged around her, and Martha began to drift between consciousness and something deeper, a gray place where the cold couldn't quite reach, and the pain became distant and manageable. She was dimly aware of footsteps approaching through the rain, heavy and deliberate. A bear, she thought hazily, come to investigate the strange creature invading its territory. Well, she was too tired to run anyway. At least it would be quick, but the voice that called out through the storm was decidedly human, deep and concerned. Miss, can you hear me?" Martha tried to respond, but her throat felt frozen. The footsteps came closer, and suddenly a large form was kneeling beside her, blocking the worst of the rain. Warm hands touched her face, checking for signs of life. "Jesus," the voice muttered. "What are you doing up here?" Through half-closed eyes, Martha saw a bearded face framed by long, dark hair, kind eyes filled with worry rather than judgment. She knew that face, though she'd only seen it a few times in Henderson's store. Ezra Stone, the mountain man who lived somewhere in these hills. Can't, she whispered through numb lips. Can't go back. Strong arms lifted her from the ground as if she weighed nothing at all. Martha wanted to protest, to tell him she was too heavy, that he'd hurt himself trying to carry her. But the words wouldn't come, and the warmth of his body against hers was too precious to reject. I've got you, Ezra said, his voice rumbling through his chest. You're safe now. As consciousness faded completely, Martha's last coherent thought was that no one had ever made her feel safe before. It was a strange gift to receive from a stranger in the middle of a storm, but she accepted it gratefully and let the darkness take her. Martha woke to the sound of crackling flames and the scent of pine smoke. For a moment, she lay still with her eyes closed, trying to piece together where she was and how she'd gotten there. Her body ached in a dozen places, and her ankle throbbed with each heartbeat. But she was warm and dry, luxuries she hadn't expected to experience again. Memory returned in fragments. The harvest dance, Thomas Brennan's cruel words, her flight into the storm, and finally, the deep voice that had called her name through the rain. Ezra Stone. The mountain man had found her and brought her somewhere safe. She opened her eyes cautiously and found herself in a small but well-built cabin. Log walls chinked with mud and moss rose to a peaked roof supported by hand-hewn beams. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, flames dancing cheerfully behind an iron screen. The furniture was simple but sturdy. A wooden table and chairs, shelves lined with books and supplies, a trunk that served as both storage and seating. Martha realized she was lying on a narrow bed, covered with thick wool blankets and furs. Someone had removed her torn dress and wet shoes, replacing them with a large flannel shirt that hung past her knees. The intimacy of the situation should have alarmed her, but she felt only gratitude for whoever had taken such care with her comfort and modesty. You're awake. The voice came from the shadowed corner near the fireplace, where Ezra Stone sat whittling a piece of wood with a small knife. In the cabin's warm light, he looked less intimidating than he had in town. Still enormous, but somehow gentler around the edges. Thank you, Martha said, her voice barely above a whisper, for saving me. I was foolish to— You were hurt, Ezra interrupted, setting aside his carving. Hurt people don't always make the best decisions. How's that ankle feeling? Martha flexed her foot experimentally and winced. Painful, but I don't think it's broken. Sprained good, though. I wrapped it while you were sleeping. He stood and moved to the stove, his movements careful and deliberate in the small space. Despite his size, he seemed to understand exactly how much room he occupied and adjusted accordingly. You should eat something. Been unconscious the better part of a day. A day. Martha's stomach clenched with worry. My sister will be frantic. The whole town will be looking for me. Storm's been too fierce for search parties. They'll likely wait for it to pass before venturing up this far. Ezra ladled something from a pot into a wooden bowl. Though I could send word if you'd like. Got ways of getting messages down the mountain. The smell of rabbit stew reached Martha's nose, rich and savory. Her stomach growled loudly, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since early morning. But accepting food from this man felt like crossing some invisible line, admitting a level of dependence that made her uncomfortable. I should go back, she said, though the thought filled her with dread. Face whatever consequences. In what clothes? Ezra gestured toward the corner where her blue dress hung over a chair, still damp and badly torn. That dress won't keep you warm for the walk down, and those shoes weren't made for mountain trails. He was right, of course. Martha looked down at the oversized flannel shirt that served as her only covering. The practical part of her mind understood that she was trapped here until the storm passed and suitable clothing could be arranged. But another part, the part that had been shaped by years of judgment and restriction, whispered that being alone with a man in such circumstances was improper, dangerous, scandalous, as if reading her thoughts. Ezra moved to the cabin's single window and peered out at the rain, still lashing the glass. Storm should break by tomorrow evening. I can fashion you something warmer to wear, or send down for proper clothes if you prefer. You don't have to— Martha began. Don't have to what? Help someone in need. Ezra turned back to face her, his dark eyes serious. That's what neighbors do, Miss Whitfield. At least it's what they should do. He knew her name, though she couldn't recall ever introducing herself. But then, Cedar Ridge was small enough that everyone knew everyone, at least by reputation. She wondered what he'd heard about her, probably the same stories everyone whispered about the spinster who couldn't keep a man. Ezra approached the bed slowly, holding the bowl of stew like an offering. I know this situation ain't proper by town standards, but you're safe here, and that's what matters most. You have my word on that. Something in his tone convinced her of his sincerity. Martha accepted the bowl gratefully, wrapping her cold fingers around its warmth. The stew was simple but well prepared, seasoned with herbs she couldn't identify. She ate slowly, aware of Ezra's presence, but not feeling pressured or judged. This is very good, she said between spoonfuls. Learn to cook out of necessity. A man gets tired of hardtack and jerky pretty quick. Ezra returned to his chair and picked up his carving again. Mountain living teaches you to make do with what you have. Martha studied him as she ate, trying to reconcile the gentle man preparing food and offering comfort with the wild hermit of local gossip. His clothes were well maintained, his cabin clean and organized. Books lined one shelf, more books than many townspeople owned. This was clearly an educated man who'd chosen isolation, not someone driven to it by lack of alternatives. How long have you lived up here? She asked. 5 years, more or less. Came west after... He paused, his hand stilling on the piece of wood. After my wife and son died. The simple statement carried such weight of grief that Martha felt her heart clench in sympathy. She'd lost love through rejection and humiliation, but he'd lost it through death, a deeper, more permanent wound. I'm sorry, she said softly. Fever took them both while I was away hunting. Came back to find them already buried. Ezra's voice remained steady, but Martha could see the pain etched in the lines around his eyes. Figured I didn't deserve to live among decent folks after that. Man should protect his family. You couldn't have known, could have stayed home. Could have been there when they needed me. He resumed carving with sharp, precise strokes. Lot of things I could have done different. Martha recognized the familiar weight of self-blame, the way guilt could reshape a person's entire understanding of themselves. She'd carried her own version for years, wondering what she could have done differently to make herself acceptable, lovable. Enough. Sometimes terrible things happen despite our best efforts, she said carefully. That doesn't make them our fault. Ezra looked up from his carving, studying her face with surprising intensity. Wise words from someone who fled into a storm rather than face a ballroom full of gossips. Heat flooded Martha's cheeks. That was different. That was cowardice, was it? Or was it a woman finally refusing to accept treatment she didn't deserve? Ezra set down his knife and leaned forward slightly. I heard what that fool Brennan said to you. Half the mountain probably heard him yelling. The memory of Thomas's public humiliation made Martha's stomach twist. The whole town thinks I'm pathetic. A desperate old maid who can't take a hint. The whole town is wrong. Ezra's voice carried quiet conviction. Any man who'd treat a woman that way in public ain't worth the powder to blow him up. And any town that finds entertainment in someone else's pain has got serious problems with its moral compass. Martha stared at him, surprised by his vehemence. When was the last time someone had defended her without qualification or condition? When had anyone suggested that the problem lay with others rather than with her? You don't know me, she said finally. Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm too much trouble, too difficult, too what? Too kind, too generous, too willing to help others, even when they don't deserve it. Ezra's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger. I've watched you in that store, Miss Whitfield. Seen how you treat every customer with respect, how you go out of your way to help young couples plan their weddings, even though it must hurt. That ain't the behavior of someone who's too much trouble. He'd been watching her. The thought should have been unsettling, but instead, Martha felt something warm, unfurling in her chest. Someone had noticed her kindness, her efforts to remain gracious despite her own pain. I don't understand, she whispered. Don't understand what? Why you're being kind to me. Why you saved me, brought me here, fed me. What do you get out of it? Ezra was quiet for so long that Martha began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Maybe I recognize someone else who's carrying more pain than they deserve. Maybe I remember what it feels like to be judged for things outside your control. He met her eyes directly. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe it's just the right thing to do. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, but the storm's fury seemed to be lessening. Martha finished her stew in contemplative silence, processing this unexpected glimpse of human kindness. She'd grown so accustomed to conditional acceptance, love offered only if she changed herself, help given only with strings attached, that Ezra's straightforward compassion felt almost foreign. "I should let you rest," he said eventually, rising from his chair. "That ankle needs time to heal, and you've been through an ordeal. Where will you sleep?" Martha asked, suddenly aware that she was occupying the cabin's only bed. "Got a bedroll?" "Floor's comfortable enough." Ezra moved toward a chest in the corner. "Used to sleeping rough anyway. I can't take your bed. This is your home, and you're my guest. Injured guest at that." His tone brooked no argument. "I've slept in worse places than my own floor, Miss Whitfield. Don't worry yourself about my comfort." Martha wanted to protest further, but exhaustion was creeping back over her like a warm tide. The combination of emotional trauma, physical injury, and simple human kindness had left her drained. She settled back against the pillows, real feather pillows, she noted with surprise, and pulled the blankets up to her chin. "Mr. Stone," she called softly as he busied himself arranging his bedroll near the fireplace. "Yes, ma'am?" "Thank you for everything." He paused in his preparations and looked back at her. In the firelight, his face seemed less harsh, more approachable. "Get some sleep, Miss Whitfield. Morning will bring its own challenges." As the fire settled to glowing embers and the cabin grew quiet, except for the steady patter of rain on the roof, Martha found herself thinking about choices and consequences. She'd fled into the storm to escape judgment and found instead an unexpected refuge. Tomorrow she would have to return to Cedar Ridge and face whatever waited there. But tonight she was safe in the mountain home of a man who'd shown her more genuine kindness in a few hours than she'd received from most people in years. It was a strange gift, this temporary reprieve from the expectations and disappointments of her normal life. Martha held it close as sleep claimed her, storing up the memory of feeling valued and protected against whatever tomorrow might bring. Martha woke to the sound of an axe biting into wood and the rich aroma of coffee brewing. Pale morning light filtered through the cabin's windows, revealing details she'd missed in the previous evening's firelight. The walls were decorated with snowshoes, hunting gear, and what appeared to be Native American artifacts, beadwork, and carved items that spoke of trade or friendship with local tribes. Her ankle felt better, though still tender when she tested it against the floor. The swelling had reduced considerably, and she could put weight on it without the sharp pain of yesterday. Ezra's shirt still hung loose around her frame, but her torn dress had dried during the night. "Morning?" came Ezra's voice from outside, followed by his heavy footsteps on the porch. He entered carrying an armload of firewood, his hair damp with morning mist. "How's the ankle?" "Much improved, thank you." Martha pulled the blankets higher, suddenly self-conscious about her informal attire. "I should be able to make it down the mountain today." Ezra stacked the wood beside the fireplace before turning to study her with those perceptive dark eyes. "You could. Question is whether you should. I don't understand. Your sister came looking for you yesterday evening, soon as the worst of the storm passed. Brought half the town council with her." Ezra moved to the stove and poured coffee into 2 tin cups. "They're mighty concerned about your reputation being up here alone with me." Martha's heart sank. She'd hoped to return quietly, to slip back into her life without additional scandal. But, of course, Elizabeth would have organized a search party, and, of course, the discovery of Martha's whereabouts would become immediate fodder for gossip. "What did you tell them?" "The truth. That I found you injured in the storm and brought you here for shelter." Ezra handed her a cup of coffee, careful not to spill it on the bedding. "Your sister seemed relieved you were safe, but some of the men with her had different concerns." "Such as?" such as whether I'd compromised you in some way. Whether your honor needed defending, Ezra's mouth tightened with distaste. Took considerable restraint not to throw the lot of them off my porch. Martha could imagine the scene, worried. Townsmen confronting the mountain hermit about propriety and reputation, while she lay unconscious and injured inside. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same people who'd whispered about her failures were now concerned about her virtue. I'm sorry they bothered you. This is exactly what I was trying to avoid. You've got nothing to apologize for. Ezra settled into his chair with his own coffee. But you should know what you're walking into when you go back. There'll be talk. There was always talk where Martha was concerned. She'd grown accustomed to being the subject of speculation and judgment. But this felt different, more serious. A single woman spending the night in a bachelor's cabin was the kind of scandal that could follow her for years. Perhaps if I explained the circumstances, won't matter to some folks. They've already made up their minds about what happened here. Ezra's voice carried a bitter edge. Amazing how quick people assume the worst. Especially about folks they've already decided are outside their precious social boundaries. Martha sipped her coffee, thinking about the impossible position she'd landed in. If she returned to town, she'd face whispers and speculation about her night with Ezra. If she stayed longer, the gossip would only grow worse. Either way, her reputation, what little remained of it, would suffer. There might be another option, Ezra said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. What do you mean? Your sister mentioned something about an inheritance. Property in Colorado left by an aunt. Ezra met her eyes directly. Maybe this is your chance to start fresh somewhere new. The inheritance. In all the drama of the past day, Martha had nearly forgotten about Aunt Clara's ranch. 300 acres and enough money to live independently. Everything she needed to escape Cedar Ridge and its limitations. I couldn't just leave. My job at the store, my responsibilities. What responsibilities? To people who've spent years making you feel unwelcome. Ezra leaned forward, his expression intent. Miss Whitfield, you've got a chance at real freedom here. Don't let fear of change keep you trapped in a life that's never truly fit you. Freedom. The word hung in the air between them like a promise. Martha had dreamed of independence for so long that the possibility of actually achieving it seemed almost unreal. But Ezra was right. What did she really have to lose by leaving Cedar Ridge? It would take weeks to arrange everything. The legal papers, selling what I can't take, deciding what to do about the store. I could help with that, Ezra offered. Got experience with property transactions, and I know lawyers in Denver who handle such things. Honest men who won't try to cheat a woman traveling alone. Martha stared at him in surprise. Why would you do that? Help me, I mean. We barely know each other. Ezra was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his large hands. When he spoke, his voice was careful, measured. Maybe because I see someone with the courage to change her life, and I remember what that kind of courage feels like. Or maybe because I think you deserve better than what this town's offered you. The kindness in his voice made Martha's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. She'd grown so accustomed to managing alone, to expecting nothing from others, that his offer of help felt overwhelming. I couldn't impose on you like that. You have your own life to live. My life consists of chopping wood, hunting game, and carving the same cross over and over again. Ezra gestured toward a shelf where dozens of wooden crosses sat in neat rows. Helping you claim your inheritance would give me something useful to do for a change. Martha followed his gaze to the crosses, each one slightly different, but clearly carved by the same hands. They were beautiful in their simplicity, but something about their repetitive nature spoke of obsession, of a mind trying to work through unresolved grief. Why crosses? She asked softly. Markers for graves I never got to visit properly. My wife and son are buried back in Kansas, and I left before I could even order proper headstones. Ezra's voice grew distant. Keep thinking if I carve enough crosses, maybe it'll balance the scales somehow. The pain in his confession hit Martha like a physical blow. Here was a man who'd isolated himself not just from society, but from his own capacity for healing. The crosses represented both memorial and penance, a way of keeping his grief alive rather than learning to live with it. They're beautiful, she said honestly. But I don't think your wife and son would want you to punish yourself forever. How would you know what they'd want? The words came out sharper than intended, and Ezra immediately looked apologetic. I'm sorry. That was uncalled for. No, you're right. I don't know what they'd want. Martha set down her coffee cup and met his gaze directly. But I know something about carrying guilt that doesn't belong to you. About letting other people's expectations shape how you see yourself. Ezra studied her face for a long moment. And what have you concluded about that? That it's easier to blame ourselves than to accept that sometimes terrible things just happen. That we can't control everything, no matter how hard we try. Martha's voice grew stronger as she spoke. I spent years thinking I wasn't good enough because men didn't want to marry me. But maybe the problem wasn't with me at all. Maybe. Ezra agreed quietly. They sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside, birds called to each other through the morning mist, and somewhere in the distance a woodpecker drummed against a tree trunk. The sounds of wilderness life continuing its ancient rhythms. Indifferent to human struggles and sorrows. I found something in your dress pocket, Ezra said eventually. Rising to retrieve a small object from the mantel. Thought you might want it back. He placed a crumpled piece of paper in Martha's hands, a letter from Aunt Clara's lawyer, detailing the inheritance. She must have brought it to the dance without thinking, perhaps as a talisman of hope for the future. 300 acres, Ezra read over her shoulder. Good grazing land, according to this. House needs work, but it's sound, and enough money to hire help for the heavy repairs. Martha stared at the legal language describing her aunt's gift, a ranch of her own, where she could live according to her own rules and answer to no one but herself. It seemed too good to be true, like something from a fairy tale rather than real life. The lawyer wants to meet within the month to finalize everything, she said, noting the date on the letter. After that, the inheritance goes to charity. More than enough time to get your affairs in order and travel to Colorado. Ezra returned to his chair. Question is whether you're brave enough to take it. Brave enough. Martha had never thought of herself as particularly courageous. She'd endured hardship and disappointment, but that was survival rather than bravery. Taking control of her own destiny, leaving everything familiar behind, that would require a different kind of courage. Entirely. What if I fail? What if I can't manage a ranch on my own? What if you succeed? What if you discover you're stronger and more capable than anyone ever gave you credit for? Ezra's eyes held a challenge. Seems to me the bigger risk is staying here and wondering what if for the rest of your life. Martha looked around the simple cabin that had provided her sanctuary. In less than 24 hours, this place and its owner had shown her possibilities she'd never considered. Ezra Stone lived according to his own choices, answerable to no social conventions beyond basic human decency. If he could build a life in the wilderness, why couldn't she build one on a Colorado ranch? I'll need to return to town first, she said slowly. Face whatever consequences await me there. Settle my affairs properly. And then, Martha took a deep breath, feeling something shift inside her chest like a door opening onto sunlight. And then I'll claim my inheritance and start the life I should have chosen years ago. Ezra's rare smile transformed his stern features. Good for you, Miss Whitfield. Takes real courage to choose freedom over safety. As if summoned by their conversation about returning to town, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the morning air. Ezra moved to the window and peered out, his expression growing serious. Your sister's back, he said. Brought the preacher with her this time. Martha's stomach dropped. Elizabeth and Reverend Morrison, that could only mean one thing. The town had decided her reputation needed salvaging through hasty marriage. Whether she wanted it or not, they can't force me to marry anyone, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. They can make your life mighty uncomfortable if you refuse, Ezra replied grimly. Small towns have their ways of dealing with folks who don't toe the line. Heavy footsteps approached the cabin, followed by Elizabeth's familiar knock. Martha, are you decent? We need to talk. Ezra looked at Martha with raised eyebrows, silently asking how she wanted to handle the situation. She pulled the blankets up to her chin and nodded toward the door. "Come in." Elizabeth, her sister, entered first, followed by Reverend Morrison, a thin man with prematurely grey hair and the pinched expression of someone perpetually disapproving of human nature. Both took in the scene, Martha in bed wearing Ezra's shirt, the mountain man standing protectively nearby with barely concealed dismay. "Oh, Martha," Elizabeth breathed. "What have you done?" "I've survived a mountain storm with Mr. Stone's generous help," Martha replied evenly. "Nothing more, nothing less." Reverend Morrison cleared his throat officiously. "Miss Whitfield, I'm afraid the appearance of impropriety is sometimes as damaging as impropriety itself. The town is talking, and your reputation—" "My reputation was already in ruins," Martha interrupted. "What exactly are you proposing to do about it?" Elizabeth and the preacher exchanged meaningful glances. Martha's heart sank as she recognized the look. They'd already decided her fate among themselves. "Mr. Stone," Reverend Morrison addressed Ezra directly, "as a Christian gentleman, surely you understand the position this situation has created. Miss Whitfield's honor requires—" "Miss Whitfield's honor is intact," Ezra said coldly. "Anyone suggesting otherwise can discuss the matter with me personally." The threat in his voice was unmistakable. Reverend Morrison took a step back, suddenly remembering that he was confronting a man who could probably break him in half without much effort. "No one's questioning your character, Mr. Stone," Elizabeth said quickly. "But surely you understand that Martha can't simply return to her old life, as if nothing happened. The scandal will die down eventually if people stop feeding it," Martha said firmly. "I won't be pushed into marriage to save appearances." "You may not have a choice," Reverend Morrison said bluntly. "The town council met this morning. If you don't marry respectably and soon, they're prepared to ask you to leave Cedar Ridge entirely." The ultimatum hung in the air like a sword. Martha felt Ezra tense beside her, his hands clenching into fists. She reached out instinctively and touched his arm. A gesture meant to calm him, but that sent unexpected warmth shooting through her own body. "Then I suppose I'll leave," she said quietly. Elizabeth gasped. "Martha, you can't be serious. Where would you go? How would you live?" "I have options." Martha's voice grew stronger with each word. "More options than I've had in years, actually." "What options?" Reverend Morrison demanded. "A woman alone with that is, with your particular circumstances. With my particular circumstances, I've inherited property in Colorado. Enough to live independently and comfortably." Martha met the preacher's shocked gaze directly. "So you see, Reverend, I don't need your help arranging a convenient marriage. I can arrange my own life, thank you very much." The silence that followed was deafening. Elizabeth sank into Ezra's chair, her face pale with shock. Reverend Morrison opened and closed his mouth like a fish gasping for air. "An inheritance?" Elizabeth finally managed. "You never said, when did this happen?" "The letter came just before the harvest dance. I was planning to tell you, but then—" Martha gestured vaguely. "Other things took precedence." "How much property?" the preacher asked, his disapproval warring with obvious curiosity about the financial details. "Enough," Martha replied firmly. She had no intention of discussing specific amounts with a man who just threatened her with exile. Ezra spoke for the first time since the conversation began. "Miss Whitfield will need time to settle her affairs before traveling to Colorado. I trust that won't be a problem." His tone made it clear that it had better not be a problem. Reverend Morrison straightened his shoulders, trying to reclaim some authority. "The town council's decision stands. If Miss Whitfield chooses to leave rather than marry appropriately, she has 2 weeks to conclude her business and depart." "That's more than enough time," Martha said. "Thank you for clarifying my options so completely, Reverend. It makes my decision much easier." Elizabeth looked stricken. "Martha, please, think about what you're doing. Colorado is so far away, and you'd be completely alone." "I've been alone here for years," Martha pointed out gently. "At least in Colorado, I'll be alone by choice rather than by default." Her sister's eyes filled with tears, and Martha felt a pang of guilt. Elizabeth meant well, even if her solutions were misguided. They'd been close as children before life had divided them into the acceptable sister and the problematic one. Could I visit you there? Once you're settled, Elizabeth asked hopefully. Of course. You'll always be welcome. Martha's voice softened. I'm not disappearing forever, Elizabeth. I'm just choosing a different life. Reverend Morrison was clearly eager to leave, his mission of forced salvation having failed spectacularly. 2 weeks, Miss Whitfield. The council expects you to honor that timeline. After they left, Martha and Ezra sat in silence for several minutes. The cabin felt somehow larger, without the weight of social pressure filling it, but Martha knew the respite was temporary. Now that her departure was public knowledge, every day in Cedar Ridge would bring fresh challenges and judgments. So it's decided then, Ezra said finally. You're really going to do it? I'm really going to do it. Martha surprised herself with the certainty in her voice. 2 weeks to pack up my entire life and start over. It seems impossible and exactly right at the same time. I meant what I said about helping with the arrangements. Travel to Colorado can be dangerous for a woman alone, and there are details about property transfer that require careful handling. Martha studied his face, looking for hidden motives or conditions. But she saw only genuine concern and the same quiet kindness he'd shown since finding her in the storm. Why? She asked. Why would you involve yourself in my problems? You barely know me. Ezra was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the wooden crosses lining his shelf. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Maybe because helping someone else find their new life is easier than figuring out my own. Maybe because I recognize courage when I see it, and I want to make sure it gets the support it deserves. He looked directly at her. Or maybe because, for the first time in 5 years, I feel like I might have something useful to contribute to the world. The honesty in his confession made Martha's chest tighten with emotion. Here was a man who'd been as isolated by circumstances as she had, finding purpose in helping her escape the trap they'd both been living in. What would you need to do? To help me, I mean. Travel to Colorado with you, for starters. Make sure you reach your property safely and that the legal transfer goes smoothly. Help you assess what repairs the house needs and hire reliable workers. Ezra's voice grew more confident as he outlined the plan. I know the territory, know which towns are safe for travelers and which ones to avoid. The idea of traveling such a distance with Ezra sent a flutter of nervous excitement through Martha's stomach. It would mean weeks in his company, sharing the challenges and discoveries of the journey. It would also mean more scandal, more whispered speculation about their relationship. People will talk, she said. People are already talking. At least this way, you'll be too far away to hear them. Ezra's smile was wry. Besides, once you're established on your own land, what people think won't matter anymore. You'll be answerable only to yourself, answerable only to herself. The phrase echoed in Martha's mind like a prayer. After 28 years of trying to meet other people's expectations, the freedom to live according to her own values seemed almost too precious to believe in. All right, she said, the words coming out in a rush before fear could stop them. Yes, I accept your help, and I'll take my chances with whatever people choose to think about it. This time Ezra's smile was full and genuine, transforming his entire face. Then we'd better get you back to town, so you can start saying your goodbyes. We've got a new life to arrange, Miss Whitfield. As Martha prepared to face Cedar Ridge one final time, she realized that something fundamental had shifted inside her. The woman who returned to town would not be the same one who'd fled into the storm. That woman had been shaped by other people's judgments and limitations. This woman was beginning to discover her own strength, her own worth, her own capacity for choosing courage over comfort. It was a transformation that had begun in the wilderness, nurtured by the unexpected kindness of a mountain man who understood what it meant to be judged for things beyond one's control. Now it would be tested in the familiar streets of Cedar Ridge, where every face would carry opinions about her choices and her future. But for the first time in her adult life, Martha found she was curious rather than afraid about what lay ahead. The unknown held possibility instead of just threat, and that change in perspective felt like the most precious gift she'd ever received. The walk back to Cedar Ridge passed in contemplative silence, Martha's ankle holding up better than expected on the rocky terrain. Ezra had fashioned her a walking stick from a sturdy pine branch and lent her a pair of his own boots, which were comically large but provided better protection than her delicate dancing slippers. Her torn blue dress had been mended as best as possible, though it would never be the same. As they crested the final hill overlooking the town, Martha paused to gather her courage. Below them, Cedar Ridge looked smaller than she remembered, a collection of wooden buildings clustered around the main street like children huddled around a fire. Smoke rose from chimneys, and she could see people moving about their daily business, unaware that their local scandal was about to walk back into their midst. "You don't have to face them alone," Ezra said quietly. "I can walk you to your door, make sure nobody bothers you unnecessarily." The offer was tempting, but Martha knew it would only fuel more gossip. "Thank you, but I think it's better if I handle this myself. People need to see that I'm not broken or ashamed of what happened. Are you ashamed, I mean?" Martha considered the question seriously. 2 days ago, she would have been mortified by the situation, spending the night in a bachelor's cabin, wearing his clothes, accepting his help and protection. But now, looking down at the town that had never quite made room for her, she felt only a quiet determination to live according to her own standards. "No," she said, surprised by the certainty in her voice. "I'm not ashamed. I survived a dangerous situation with help from a good man. If people want to make something sordid out of that, it says more about them than about me." Ezra nodded approvingly. "That's the spirit. Remember that feeling when the whispers start." They parted ways at the edge of town, Ezra melting back into the forest with the quiet grace of someone accustomed to avoiding unwanted attention. Martha continued alone down Main Street, her borrowed boots clunking against the wooden boardwalk with each step. The first person to notice her return was Mrs. Patterson, who dropped her market basket in shock before hurrying off to spread the news. Within minutes, Martha could feel eyes watching her from windows and doorways. Conversations stopped as she passed, replaced by the kind of charged silence that preceded either celebration or catastrophe. She reached Henderson's general store to find Mr. Henderson himself waiting on the front steps. His weathered face creased with concern. "Martha, thank goodness you're safe. When Elizabeth said you'd spent the night up at Stone's place," he shook his head. "Whole town's been in an uproar." "I'm quite well, Mr. Henderson. Mr. Stone was very kind to provide shelter during the storm." Martha kept her voice level and matter-of-fact. "I assume my position at the store is still available." Henderson's expression grew uncomfortable. "Well now, that's a bit complicated. What with all the talk and the town council meeting this morning." "I understand." Martha had expected this, but it still stung. "How long do I have to train my replacement?" 2 weeks should be sufficient. "I'm sorry, Martha, truly. You've been a good worker, but with business depending on community goodwill." "Of course. I'll begin organizing the inventory records this afternoon." Martha climbed the external stairs to her apartment, leaving Henderson looking relieved that the conversation had gone so smoothly. Her small rooms felt different after the rustic simplicity of Ezra's cabin. The furniture that had once seemed adequate now struck her as fussy and impractical. Doilies and decorative cushions served no purpose beyond appearance, and the delicate china tea set would be useless on a working ranch. Martha moved to her wardrobe and pulled out the never-worn wedding dress. In the afternoon light, it seemed less like a symbol of broken dreams and more like evidence of a life she'd never really wanted anyway. The ivory silk was beautiful but fragile, designed for a woman who would spend her days receiving callers and planning dinner parties. It had no place in the future she was beginning to envision. A knock at her door interrupted her contemplation. She opened it to find Sarah Mitchell on the threshold, her pretty face flushed with determination. "I don't care what anyone says," Sarah announced without preamble. "You're my friend, and I want to hear the truth from you, not from gossips and busybodies." Martha stepped aside to let her in, grateful for at least one person willing to listen rather than assume. The truth is quite simple. I got caught in the storm. Mr. Stone found me injured, and he provided shelter until I could return safely. That's what I told my mother, but she said—" Sarah stopped herself. "Well, it doesn't matter what she said. I know you, Martha Whitfield, and you're the most honorable person in this town." The fierce loyalty in Sarah's voice brought tears to Martha's eyes. "Thank you. That means more than you know. Is it true what they're saying about an inheritance? That you're leaving Cedar Ridge?" "It's true." Martha settled into her parlor chair, gesturing for Sarah to take the other. "My aunt left me property in Colorado. A ranch where I can live independently." Sarah's eyes widened with a mixture of admiration and envy. "Ah, how wonderful. And how terrifying. Won't you be lonely, living so far from everything familiar?" "I've been lonely here for years," Martha replied honestly. "At least in Colorado, I'll have the freedom to build the life I actually want, instead of trying to fit into spaces that were never meant for me." They talked for another hour, Sarah asking eager questions about ranch life and travel plans, while Martha shared what little she knew about her aunt's property. It felt good to have someone treat her departure as an adventure rather than a scandal or tragedy. After Sarah left, Martha began the practical work of dismantling her life in Cedar Ridge. She made lists of belongings to sell, items to donate, and possessions worth shipping to Colorado. The wedding dress would go to Sarah, who was closer to Martha's size than most young women in town. The delicate china would be sold, along with most of the furniture. As evening approached, Elizabeth arrived with a basket of food and red-rimmed eyes that suggested she'd been crying. "I still can't believe you're really leaving," Elizabeth said, settling at Martha's kitchen table. "Colorado is so far away. What if something happens to you? What if something wonderful happens to me?" Martha countered gently. "Elizabeth, I've spent my entire adult life playing it safe, trying to be what other people wanted. Where has it gotten me? 3 failed engagements and a reputation as the town's cautionary tale. But to travel such a distance with that mountain man, Martha, people are saying terrible things about your relationship with him. People said terrible things about me when I was perfectly respectable too," Martha pointed out. "Mr. Stone has offered to help me reach my property safely. I trust him more than I trust most of the respectable men in this town." Elizabeth looked shocked. "You trust him?" "Martha, he's a stranger, a hermit who lives like a savage in the wilderness. He's a man who saved my life and asked for nothing in return, who treated me with more kindness and respect in 2 days than I've received from this entire town in years." Martha's voice grew firm. "I won't hear him disparaged, Elizabeth. Not when he's shown me more genuine concern than most people I've known my whole life." Her sister stared at her as if seeing a stranger. "You've changed. Even since yesterday you seem different. Harder somehow." "Not harder, stronger. There's a difference." Martha reached across the table to squeeze Elizabeth's hand. "I know this is difficult for you to understand, but for the first time in my life, I feel like I have choices. Real choices about who I want to be and how I want to live. And you want to be someone who lives alone on a ranch in Colorado? I want to be someone who gets to decide that for herself," Martha said simply. Over the following days, word of Martha's plans spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire. The reactions varied from grudging admiration to open disapproval. But most people seemed relieved that the town's most persistent scandal would soon resolve itself through departure. Martha threw herself into the work of preparation, selling furniture and household goods with methodical efficiency. The china set went to the banker's wife, who paid a fair price while making pointed comments about such a shame to see family heirlooms scattered to the winds. The parlor furniture sold to a young couple just starting their married life, and Martha felt a pang of satisfaction watching them arrange the pieces in their new home. Each sale and donation felt like shedding unnecessary weight, stripping away the accumulated expectations and disappointments of her old life. She kept only what was practical: sturdy clothing, basic cookware, a few precious books, and her grandmother's sewing machine, which would be invaluable on a working ranch. The most difficult decision involved her father's medical instruments. Dr. Whitfield had been Cedar Ridge's physician for 30 years before his death, and his surgical tools and reference books had educational value. Martha finally decided to donate them to the young doctor who'd taken over the practice, knowing her father would have approved of keeping them in service. 3 days into her preparations, she looked up from packing books to find Ezra standing in her doorway. In town clothes rather than his usual frontier garb, he looked almost civilized, though his imposing size still drew stares from passers-by. "Afternoon, Miss Whitfield. Thought I'd check on your progress and discuss travel arrangements." Martha invited him in, acutely aware of how her small room seemed to shrink around his presence. He moved carefully through her space, clearly conscious of his effect on delicate furnishings. "I've been in touch with a freight company about shipping your belongings," he said, settling gingerly onto her remaining parlor chair. "They can get your heavy items to Denver, and we can arrange transport from there to your property." "How did you manage that so quickly?" "Sent a telegram to an old friend who runs a shipping business, and told him it was important." Ezra's expression grew serious. "I also made inquiries about the route to Colorado. There have been reports of trouble along some of the usual paths, bandits targeting travelers, especially those who might be carrying money or valuables." Martha felt a chill of apprehension. "What kind of trouble?" "The kind that makes traveling alone inadvisable for anyone, but especially for a woman with an inheritance to claim." Ezra leaned forward slightly. "I know we discussed this before, but I want to make sure you understand what you're agreeing to. The journey will take at least 2 weeks, possibly longer, depending on weather and road conditions. We'll be camping most nights, sharing meals and campfire conversations. People who see us will assume we're married or courting." "And what will we assume?" The question slipped out before Martha could stop it, and she felt heat flood her cheeks. Ezra was quiet for a moment, his dark eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her heart race. "We'll assume we're two people helping each other toward better lives. Nothing more, nothing less." The careful neutrality in his voice should have been reassuring, but Martha found herself oddly disappointed, which was ridiculous. She'd just declared her independence from romantic entanglements. And here she was, feeling let down that her traveling companion wanted to keep things purely practical. "Of course," she said quickly. "That's very sensible, is it?" Ezra's voice had grown softer, more thoughtful. "Sometimes I wonder if being sensible is just another way of avoiding what scares us." Before Martha could ask what he meant, Elizabeth's voice called from the bottom of the stairs. "Martha, are you receiving visitors? Mrs. Henderson said she saw that mountain man heading up to your rooms." Ezra's expression darkened at the description, but he rose politely as Elizabeth appeared in the doorway. Martha's sister took in the scene, the intimate conversation, the way they'd been sitting close together, the obvious comfort between them, with barely concealed alarm. "Mr. Stone was discussing travel arrangements for my journey to Colorado," Martha explained. "How thoughtful." Elizabeth's tone suggested it was anything but, though I'm sure such arrangements could be made through proper channels without requiring private meetings. "Miss Whitfield's safety is my primary concern," Ezra replied evenly. "Private meetings ensure we can discuss potential dangers without causing unnecessary alarm among townsfolk." It was a reasonable explanation, but Martha could see that Elizabeth wasn't convinced. Her sister's protective instincts were warring with her disapproval of the unconventional arrangement, creating a tension that filled the small room. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation later," Martha suggested. "I'm sure Mr. Stone has other business to attend to." Ezra nodded and moved toward the door, pausing to address Elizabeth directly. "Your sister is a remarkable woman, Miss Whitfield. She deserves to have her courage supported rather than questioned." After he left, Elizabeth sank into the chair he'd vacated. "Martha, I'm worried about you. The way you look at that man, the way he looks at you. This isn't just about safe travel to Colorado, is it?" Martha busied herself with folding linens, avoiding her sister's too perceptive gaze. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do. And I think you're playing with fire." Elizabeth's voice grew urgent. He's not like us, Martha. He's been living wild in the mountains for years. What do you really know about him, about his past? I know he saved my life. I know he's treated me with more respect and kindness than any man in this town ever has. Martha set down the linens and faced her sister directly. I know that when he looks at me, he sees Martha Whitfield, the person, not Martha Whitfield, the problem to be solved. And what happens when you reach Colorado? When you're alone with him on your ranch, miles from any neighbors or help? Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. What happens if he expects payment for his assistance? What happens if you're wrong about his character? The questions hit closer to home than Martha wanted to admit. She was trusting her future to a man she'd known for less than a week, basing that trust on intuition rather than evidence. But the alternative, making the journey alone or not making it at all, seemed far more dangerous than any risk Ezra might represent. "Then I'll deal with whatever happens," she said finally. "I'd rather take my chances with uncertainty than accept the certainty of staying here and slowly disappearing into other people's expectations." Elizabeth left soon after. Her parting words, a mixture of blessing and warning. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Martha. And I hope the price isn't higher than you're prepared to pay." As Martha continued her packing that evening, she found herself thinking about Elizabeth's concerns and Ezra's cryptic comment about avoiding what scared them. The truth was, she was scared, terrified actually. Scared of leaving everything familiar, scared of failing on her own, scared of trusting a man whose past remained largely mysterious. But she was also scared of staying, of accepting the narrow life Cedar Ridge offered, of never discovering what she might be capable of if given the chance to try. Between two kinds of fear, she chose the one that led toward possibility rather than away from it. In his cabin that night, Ezra worked by lamplight on a different kind of project. Instead of another wooden cross, his hands shaped a small wooden box with careful attention to detail. Inside, wrapped in soft cloth, lay a cluster of wild roses he'd picked that morning, the first flowers he'd gathered since Sarah's death 5 years ago. He wasn't sure what had prompted him to preserve them, just as he wasn't sure what was driving his determination to help Martha claim her new life. All he knew was that her courage had awakened something in him that he'd thought was buried forever, a desire to build rather than merely endure, to look forward instead of backward. Tomorrow he would give her the roses, though he wasn't sure how to explain their significance. Perhaps it was enough that they represented beauty chosen freely, preserved not out of obligation, but out of simple appreciation for something that brought light into darkness. Like Martha herself, they were a gift he hadn't expected, but couldn't imagine refusing. The wooden box appeared on Martha's windowsill the next morning like a gift from the forest itself. She discovered it while preparing her simple breakfast, drawn by something that caught the light differently than her usual view of Main Street. Inside, nestled in soft cloth, lay wild roses preserved with such care that they seemed to glow with captured sunlight. No note accompanied the gift, but Martha knew immediately who had left it. The roses were mountain varieties she'd never seen before, deep pink petals edged with cream, their stems thornless and perfect. Someone had spent considerable time preparing them, removing every blemish and arranging them with an artist's attention to beauty. She held the box carefully, breathing in the faint fragrance that still clung to the preserved flowers. When was the last time someone had given her flowers simply because they were beautiful? When had anyone thought her worthy of such a gesture? A soft knock interrupted her wonder. Martha set the box aside and opened her door to find Ezra standing in the early morning shadows, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something that looked almost shy. "Morning, Miss Whitfield. Hope you don't mind me calling so early." "Not at all." "Please come in." Martha stepped aside, then gestured toward the windowsill. "Thank you for the roses. They're beautiful." Ezra's cheeks darkened slightly beneath his beard, seemed ashamed to let them fade on the vine when they could bring someone pleasure instead. The simple explanation carried deeper meaning, and Martha found herself studying his face for clues to his thoughts. This was the same man who carved endless crosses as penance for losses beyond his control, yet he'd taken time to preserve beauty for her enjoyment. The contradiction spoke to complexities she was only beginning to understand. "I've never seen roses like these before. Do they grow wild in the mountains?" "Found them growing near a natural spring about 10 miles up the ridge. Been meaning to come back for them, but," Ezra shrugged, "never seemed worth the effort before." "Before what?" The question hung unspoken between them, charged with possibilities Martha wasn't ready to examine too closely. Instead, she busied herself preparing coffee, using the familiar ritual to calm her racing thoughts. "I received a telegram yesterday," she said, placing a cup in his hands. "From Aunt Clara's lawyer in Denver. He'll meet us there to finalize the property transfer." "Good. Denver's a safe enough place to conduct business. And there are supply stores where we can outfit you properly for ranch life." Ezra settled into her remaining chair, which creaked ominously under his weight. "Speaking of which, we should discuss what you'll need for the journey." They spent the next hour planning practical details: clothing suitable for camping, supplies for the trail, arrangements for her heavier belongings. But beneath the logistics, Martha sensed a current of tension she couldn't quite identify. Every accidental touch as they shared papers sent electricity shooting up her arm. Every time their eyes met across the small table, she felt something flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with travel anxiety. "There's something else we need to discuss," Ezra said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "People in town are talking about us, making assumptions about the nature of our relationship." Martha's cheeks heated. "What kind of assumptions?" "The kind that suggest a woman doesn't travel alone with a man unless they're married or intending to be." Ezra met her gaze directly. "It might make things easier if people believed we were courting. Give them a respectable explanation for our association." The suggestion hit Martha like a physical blow. After years of failed courtships and public rejections, the idea of pretending romantic attachment, even for practical purposes, felt like a cruel mockery of her dreams. "I see. And what would such a pretense require?" "Nothing more than letting people draw their own conclusions. We wouldn't need to lie outright, just not correct their assumptions." Ezra's expression was unreadable. "Of course, if the idea makes you uncomfortable." "It's very practical," Martha interrupted, forcing her voice to remain steady. "You're right that it would give people a conventional explanation for our arrangement." But even as she agreed to the deception, Martha felt something twist painfully in her chest. The roses on her windowsill seemed to mock her now. A gesture that had felt romantic was merely another practical consideration, a way to make their business relationship more palatable to small-town gossips. "There's a church social this evening," she said, focusing on immediate practicalities rather than her bruised feelings. "If we're going to establish this fiction, it might be wise to appear together in public." Ezra nodded slowly. "If you're certain you want to endure the scrutiny, people will be watching everything we do, looking for signs to confirm their suspicions. Then we'll give them what they expect to see." Martha rose and moved to her window, staring out at the town that had never quite accepted her. A woman grateful for male protection and a man charitable enough to provide it. The bitter edge in her voice made Ezra frown. "Martha." "Miss Whitfield," she corrected automatically. "We should maintain proper formalities, shouldn't we? Even in private." Something flickered across Ezra's features, hurt, perhaps, or disappointment. But he recovered quickly, his expression settling back into careful neutrality. "Of course. Miss Whitfield it is." After he left to make additional travel preparations, Martha sat alone in her parlor, staring at the roses that no longer seemed quite so beautiful. She'd been foolish to read romantic meaning into a practical gesture, foolish to think a man like Ezra Stone might see her as anything more than a problem requiring solution. But perhaps that was for the best. Romance had brought her nothing but pain and humiliation. A practical arrangement, honestly acknowledged, would serve her far better than dreams that led nowhere but disappointment. That evening, Martha dressed with unusual care for the church social. She chose her best remaining dress, deep green wool that flattered her coloring and fit properly despite her size. She arranged her hair in a simple but elegant style and added her grandmother's pearl earrings as a final touch. If she was going to play the role of woman being courted, she would do it with dignity. Ezra called for her at 7 o'clock sharp, wearing dark trousers and a white shirt that emphasized his impressive shoulders. He'd trimmed his beard and tied back his hair, transforming himself from mountain hermit to respectable gentleman. The change was startling and somehow unsettling. This version of Ezra looked like someone who might court a woman for real, rather than for convenience. "You look lovely," he said, offering his arm as they descended her stairs. "Thank you. You clean up quite well yourself." Martha kept her tone light and friendly, the way she might speak to any acquaintance providing escort service. The church hall buzzed with conversation that died abruptly when they entered together. Martha felt the weight of dozens of eyes assessing their every move, looking for evidence to support the gossip already circulating. She smiled serenely and allowed Ezra to guide her toward the refreshment table, playing her part with practiced ease. "Miss Whitfield, how lovely to see you this evening." Mrs. Henderson appeared at their side, with the bright smile of someone scenting fresh gossip. "And Mr. Stone, what a pleasant surprise. We don't often see you at our social gatherings." "Miss Whitfield was kind enough to invite me," Ezra replied smoothly. "Seemed ashamed to miss the opportunity for civilized company." The response was perfectly pitched, polite but warm, suggesting just enough personal interest to fuel speculation without crossing into impropriety. Mrs. Henderson's eyes practically gleamed with the prospect of fresh information to share. "How wonderful that you two have become acquainted. I'm sure Mr. Stone's knowledge of the frontier will be invaluable for your upcoming journey." "Miss Whitfield?" "Indeed. Mr. Stone has been most helpful in making arrangements." Martha accepted a cup of punch from Ezra, their fingers brushing briefly as he handed it to her. The contact sent an unwelcome jolt of awareness through her body, and she pulled her hand away perhaps too quickly. They circulated through the room together, accepting congratulations on Martha's inheritance and fielding carefully worded questions about their travel plans. Ezra proved surprisingly adept at social conversation, deflecting intrusive inquiries with gentle humor while maintaining the fiction of their courtship through small attentions. A hand at her elbow when navigating the crowd, his coat offered when she shivered near an open window. "You're very good at this," Martha murmured during a brief lull in conversation. "At what?" "Playing the attentive suitor. You almost have me convinced." Something shifted in Ezra's expression, a shadow that passed too quickly for Martha to interpret. Years of practice reading people, I suppose, knowing what they want to see. Before Martha could ask what he meant, Sarah Mitchell approached with her fiancé James in tow. The young couple looked radiant with happiness, their love so obvious it seemed to glow around them like candlelight. "Martha, I'm so glad you came tonight." Sarah embraced her warmly before turning to Ezra with curious eyes. "And you must be Mr. Stone. I've heard so much about you. Nothing too scandalous." "I hope," Ezra replied with a slight smile, "only that you're a hero who saved our dear Martha from a terrible storm." Sarah's voice carried genuine gratitude. "We're all so thankful she found such a gallant protector." James nodded his agreement. "Takes a special kind of man to venture out in weather like that." "Miss Whitfield is fortunate to have such a devoted—" He paused, clearly fishing for clarification about their relationship status. "Friend," Martha supplied quickly, then felt Ezra's hand settle gently on her back, a gesture that suggested something deeper than friendship while allowing her words to stand unchallenged. "The best kind of friend," Sarah agreed with a knowing smile. "The kind who sees what really matters." As the evening progressed, Martha found herself caught between contradictory emotions. Part of her appreciated how smoothly their performance was proceeding. People were accepting the courtship narrative without question, making her departure seem respectable rather than scandalous. But another part of her felt increasingly uncomfortable with the charade. especially when she caught herself responding genuinely to Ezra's attention, when he brought her a plate of cake without being asked, when he listened attentively to her conversation with the schoolteacher's wife, when he helped her retrieve a dropped glove with elaborate courtesy. These gestures felt real, in a way that made her heart race, despite her determination to remain practical. The evening's most challenging moment came when Reverend Morrison approached. With obvious purpose gleaming in his eyes, "Mr. Stone, Miss Whitfield, I'm delighted to see you both here tonight, participating in our community fellowship." His tone suggested anything but delight. "I hope we might expect to see more of you in the coming weeks, Mr. Stone." "That depends on circumstances, Reverend." Ezra's voice was carefully neutral. "Indeed. Circumstances such as the length of Miss Whitfield's stay in our community." Morrison's pale eyes fixed on Martha with uncomfortable intensity. "I trust you're finding adequate spiritual guidance as you prepare for such a momentous journey." The implied criticism was clear. Martha's departure represented a failure of Christian submission to community will. She felt her temper flare, but before she could respond, Ezra stepped slightly forward. "Miss Whitfield's spiritual welfare is in excellent hands, Reverend. Her courage in claiming the independence God has provided her shows remarkable faith in divine providence." It was a masterful response that reframed Martha's choice as religious obedience rather than rebellion. Morrison's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish as he searched for a comeback that wouldn't challenge divine will directly. "Yes. Well, naturally we hope all our young people make choices that honor their families and community ties. I'm sure Miss Whitfield's choices honor the finest traditions of Christian womanhood," Ezra replied smoothly. "Independence, courage, and charitable concern for others, qualities any community should be proud to have nurtured." Martha stared at him in amazement. He'd not only defended her decision, but elevated it to virtuous status, leaving Morrison no room for further criticism without appearing uncharitable himself. "Quite right." Quite right," Morrison mumbled, clearly eager to escape the conversation he'd initiated. As the preacher retreated, Martha touched Ezra's arm gratefully. "Thank you. That was brilliantly done. Man needed reminding that Christianity is supposed to be about love and support, not control and judgment." Ezra's eyes followed Morrison's retreat with distaste. Amazing how some folks twist faith into a weapon for keeping others in line. The fierce conviction in his voice revealed depths Martha hadn't suspected. This wasn't just polite deflection of criticism. It was genuine anger at the treatment she'd received from people who claimed moral authority. "You sound like you speak from experience," she said. Quietly, "My wife used to say that the worst kind of sin was using God's name to justify cruelty." Ezra's expression grew distant. "Took me a long time to understand what she meant, but watching how this town treats you, it's starting to make sense." The reference to his wife sent an unexpected pang through Martha's chest. She'd almost forgotten that his kindness toward her might stem from loyalty to another woman's memory, rather than any particular feeling for Martha herself. "She sounds like a wise woman." She was. Sarah always saw people's hearts rather than their circumstances. Ezra's gaze returned to Martha with startling intensity. "I think she would have liked you very much." The compliment should have pleased her, but instead it highlighted the impossible situation she found herself in. Ezra was being kind to her because she reminded him of his beloved wife, not because Martha herself inspired any special feeling. She was a substitute, a way for him to honor Sarah's memory through charity toward another woman in need. The realization settled over her like a cold fog, chilling her despite the warm room. Of course, it explained everything. His immediate willingness to help, his protective instincts, his gentle treatment of her feelings. She wasn't Martha Whitfield to him. She was an echo of the woman he'd lost. "I should probably be getting home," she said, suddenly desperate to escape the suffocating pretense of the evening. "Tomorrow we'll be busy with final preparations." Ezra nodded and offered his arm for the walk back to her rooms. They moved through the cooling night air in silence. The easy companionship of earlier, replaced by something more complex and uncomfortable. "You've been quiet since we left the church," Ezra observed as they reached her stairs. "Just tired." "It's been an eventful week." Martha paused with her hand on the railing, gathering courage for what needed to be said. "Mr. Stone, Ezra, I want you to know how grateful I am for everything you've done. The rescue, the help with travel arrangements, tonight's performance. His voice sharpened slightly. "The courtship charade. You played your part perfectly." Martha forced herself to meet his eyes. "I hope it wasn't too difficult, pretending romantic interest in someone like me." Ezra stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the moonlight. When he spoke, his voice was very quiet. "Is that what you think this is? A performance? Pretense? Isn't it?" Martha's voice came out smaller than she'd intended. "A practical arrangement to make my departure more socially acceptable?" "I see." Ezra stepped back slightly, creating distance between them. "And what gave you that impression?" "You did. This morning, when you suggested people might assume we were courting, you presented it as a strategic consideration, a way to avoid gossip." Martha's words tumbled out in a rush. "Which was very practical and considerate, but I don't want you to feel obligated to continue the charade any longer than necessary." "Obligated." Ezra repeated the word as if tasting something bitter. "You think I've been acting out of obligation, haven't you?" "Out of obligation or kindness or—" Martha swallowed hard. "Or because I remind you of someone you lost?" The silence that followed was deafening. Ezra's face had gone completely still, and Martha realized she'd struck closer to the truth than she'd intended. "I see I've been less than clear about my motivations," he said finally. "Perhaps it's better if we do keep things strictly practical from here forward. Avoid any further misunderstandings." The formal distance in his voice hit Martha like a slap. She'd been right then. His kindness had been charitable rather than personal, and her honesty had embarrassed them both by forcing the truth into the open. Of course, that would be much more sensible. Martha's voice sounded steady despite the way her chest was tightening. "I'll be ready to depart whenever you deem it appropriate. 3 days should be sufficient to complete your business here. We'll leave at first light on Thursday." "Very well. Good night, Mr. Stone." "Good night, Miss Whitfield." Martha climbed her stairs without looking back, though she could feel his presence in the street below until she reached her door. Only when she was safely inside did she allow herself to lean against the closed door and acknowledge the tears threatening to fall. She'd been a fool to think someone like Ezra Stone might genuinely care for someone like her. He was a good man doing his Christian duty, helping a woman in need because his conscience demanded it. The roses, the gentle touches, the protective instincts, all were products of decent character rather than personal feeling, which was exactly what she told herself she wanted. A practical arrangement with no emotional complications. So why did getting what she'd asked for feel so much like losing something precious she'd never really had? In the street below, Ezra stood motionless for several minutes after Martha's door closed. Her words echoed in his mind, each one a small blade cutting at assumptions he hadn't realized he was making. She thought he was helping her out of obligation, thought his attention was charitable rather than genuine, thought she reminded him of Sarah, as if his feelings for her were merely displaced grief seeking an outlet. The truth was far more complicated and infinitely more dangerous. Martha Whitfield didn't remind him of his wife at all. Sarah had been delicate and conventional, content to live within society's expectations. Martha was something else entirely. A woman discovering her own strength, claiming her own freedom, brave enough to choose uncertainty over safety. She inspired feelings in him that had nothing to do with Sarah's memory and everything to do with Martha's courage. Martha's kindness, Martha's quiet dignity in the face of cruelty. But she clearly couldn't imagine anyone caring for her simply because she was worthy of care, which, he supposed, was exactly what a lifetime of rejection and judgment would teach a person to expect. He began the long walk back to his cabin, the roses he'd given her that morning feeling like a mistake now. Tomorrow, he would focus on practical preparations for their journey, keeping his unwelcome feelings carefully hidden. She'd made it clear that charity was all she expected from him, and charity was all she would receive, even if it killed something in him to maintain such careful distance. From the woman who'd brought light back into his carefully darkened world, Martha's final day in Cedar Ridge dawned grey and drizzling, as if the sky itself mourned her departure. She'd spent the previous 2 days in a whirlwind of activity, finalizing sales, packing her remaining belongings, and enduring a steady stream of visitors who came to say farewell with varying degrees of sincerity. Now, with most of her possessions already shipped ahead to Denver, her rooms felt hollow and strange. The walls that had sheltered her for 7 years seemed to echo with the ghosts of dreams she was finally brave enough to abandon. A sharp knock interrupted her melancholy reverie. Martha opened the door expecting Ezra, but instead found a well-dressed stranger with keen grey eyes and an expensive leather satchel, Miss Martha Whitfield. His voice carried the crisp authority of professional business. "I'm Harrison Mitchell, attorney from Denver. I represent the estate of Clara Whitfield." Martha's heart leapt with excitement and anxiety. "Mr. Mitchell, I wasn't expecting you until we reached Denver. Please come in." The lawyer entered her sparse parlor, his eyes taking quick inventory of the packed boxes and bare furniture. "I apologize for the unexpected arrival, but urgent matters require immediate attention. There have been complications regarding your inheritance." The word complications sent ice through Martha's veins. She gestured toward her remaining chair while settling onto a packing crate. "What kind of complications?" Mitchell opened his satchel and withdrew a thick folder of documents. "Shortly before her death, your aunt made additional provisions to her will. Provisions that significantly alter the terms of your inheritance." Martha's mouth went dry. "I don't understand." "The letter said the property would be mine if I claimed it within 6 months. That remains true. However, your aunt added specific conditions regarding how the property may be used and managed." Mitchell's expression was grave as he consulted the papers. "Miss Whitfield, your aunt was aware of your circumstances. In Cedar Ridge, the failed engagements, the social difficulties." Heat flooded Martha's cheeks. Even in death, Aunt Clara's knowledge of her humiliations felt like a fresh wound. "Yes?" "She was concerned that you might find yourself in similar circumstances in Colorado, isolated, vulnerable to fortune hunters, unable to manage a large property without male assistance." Mitchell's voice grew gentler. In her wisdom, she crafted a solution. He handed Martha a document dense with legal terminology. As she scanned the text, certain phrases jumped out with devastating clarity. Marriage requirement, suitable husband approved by estate trustees, forfeiture of property if unmarried after 1 year. "This can't be right," Martha whispered, reading the passage again. "She's requiring me to marry within a year of claiming the inheritance?" "I'm afraid so. Your aunt believed that frontier life would be too dangerous and difficult for a woman alone. The will specifies that you must be married to a man of good character, approved by the estate trustees within 12 months of taking possession. Failure to meet this condition results in forfeiture of the property to charity." Martha stared at the document, watching her dreams of independence crumble into dust. "And if I refuse to accept these terms? Then the inheritance goes directly to charity, and you receive nothing." The room seemed to spin around her. After years of failed courtships and public humiliation, she was being forced to marry again, not for love or even social pressure, but as a legal requirement for financial survival. "Who are these trustees who must approve my choice of husband?" Mitchell consulted another document. 3 prominent Denver businessmen, all friends of your aunt. They're empowered to reject any suitor they deem unsuitable based on character, financial stability, or ability to manage ranch property. And if they reject everyone I might choose, then you forfeit the inheritance." Mitchell's expression was sympathetic but firm. "Miss Whitfield, I understand this comes as a shock, but your aunt genuinely believed she was protecting you." Frontier life is harsh, and a woman alone faces dangers that a woman with a husband would somehow be immune to. Martha's voice rose despite her efforts to control it. Mr. Mitchell, I came here to escape the requirement that my worth be determined by marital status. Now you're telling me that even my inheritance depends on finding a man willing to marry me? The lawyer shifted uncomfortably. The terms are quite clear, I'm afraid. However, the trustees are reasonable men. If you can present a suitable candidate, Martha laughed bitterly. Like the 3 men who already found me unsuitable here in Cedar Ridge? Like the dozens of bachelors who've made it clear they'd rather remain single than marry someone of my particular circumstances? Mitchell's discomfort deepened. Perhaps if you approached the matter practically rather than romantically. A business arrangement, so to speak. There are many men on the frontier who would welcome the opportunity to marry into property. Ownership. You're suggesting I buy a husband? I'm suggesting you consider all available options before abandoning a substantial inheritance. Martha set the documents aside and moved to her window, staring out at the town that had shaped her understanding of her own limitations. She'd thought Aunt Clara's bequest was a gift of freedom, but it was actually another cage, more comfortable perhaps, but still defined by someone else's judgment of what a woman needed. How long do I have to decide? The inheritance must be claimed within the original 6-month deadline, which gives you approximately 5 months. Once claimed, you have 1 year to fulfill the marriage requirement, 5 months to find a man willing to marry her for practical reasons, then convince 3 strangers that he was worthy of their approval. The whole situation was farcical, if it weren't so devastating. I need time to consider this information. Of course. I'll be staying at the hotel overnight before returning to Denver. If you decide to proceed, I can accompany you to Colorado to begin the process. Mitchell gathered his papers with efficient movements. Miss Whitfield, I know this isn't what you hoped to hear, but perhaps it's not as impossible as it seems. You're clearly an intelligent, capable woman. Surely you could find a practical arrangement that serves everyone's interests. After he left, Martha sank onto her remaining packing crate and stared at the legal documents that had just destroyed her carefully planned future. The irony was crushing. She'd finally found the courage to live independently, only to discover that independence was being legally withheld from her. A heavier knock announced Ezra's arrival. Martha opened the door to find him loaded with supplies for their journey, his expression expectant and oddly formal. Ready for our departure tomorrow? He paused, taking in her expression. What's wrong? Martha gestured toward the documents scattered on her crate. My inheritance comes with conditions I wasn't aware of. Significant conditions. Ezra set down his supplies and picked up the legal papers, his frown deepening as he read. When he finished, his face was grim. Your aunt required you to marry, within 1 year of claiming the property, to a man approved by trustees who've never met me. Martha's voice was hollow with disappointment. It seems even in death, the women in my family believe I'm incapable of managing my own life. Ezra was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents with lawyer-like attention to detail. These trustees, do you know anything about them? Only their names. Businessmen in Denver, apparently friends of my aunt. Martha rubbed her temples, feeling a headache building. Mr. Mitchell suggested I approach it as a business arrangement. Find someone willing to marry for practical reasons. And what do you think about that suggestion? Martha looked up to find Ezra watching her with unreadable intensity. I think it's exactly the kind of loveless arrangement I was trying to escape. Marriage reduced to a financial transaction, with my worth determined by someone else's approval, even if the arrangement served your interests as well as his. Something in his tone made Martha's heart skip. What do you mean? Ezra set the papers aside and moved closer, his large frame filling her small parlor. I mean that maybe this complication is actually an opportunity. A chance to create the kind of partnership that serves both parties without the usual expectations and disappointments. I don't understand. Marry me? The words hit Martha like a physical blow. She stared at him, certain she'd misheard. What? Marry me, Ezra repeated, his voice steady and serious. I can manage ranch property. I have enough savings to contribute to the operation, and I'm tired of living alone in the mountains. You need a husband to claim your inheritance. I need a reason to rejoin the world. We could help each other, Martha's mind reeled. You're proposing a business arrangement. I'm proposing a partnership between two people who understand each other's circumstances. No romantic expectations, no false promises. Just two adults agreeing to build a life together based on mutual respect and shared goals. The offer was everything Mitchell had suggested she might find. Practical, logical, mutually beneficial. It would solve her immediate problem and give her access to the independence she craved. So why did it feel like another kind of rejection? What about love? What about the possibility of finding real happiness with someone? Ezra's expression grew distant. I had love once. Lost it to circumstances beyond my control. I'm not looking to replace what I lost, just to build something different with what's left. He met her eyes directly. And you've had enough experience with romance to know it's not always the blessing people claim it to be. He was right, of course. Romance had brought her nothing but pain and humiliation. A practical marriage to a man she respected might be far more satisfying than the emotional roller coaster of traditional courtship. The trustees would have to approve you. I can present references, financial statements, proof of property management experience. I'm educated, responsible, and capable of running a ranch efficiently. Ezra's voice carried quiet confidence. What more could they want in a husband for their ward? And you'd be willing to tie yourself legally to someone like me? Give up your freedom for a stranger's inheritance? You're not a stranger, Martha. You're a woman of courage and character who deserves the chance to live according to her own choices. Ezra's voice grew softer. And my freedom consists of carving the same crosses night after night, living with ghosts instead of possibilities. Maybe it's time I chose something different. Martha stared at him, trying to process the sudden reversal of her situation. An hour ago, she'd thought her dreams were destroyed. Now she was being offered a way to achieve everything she'd wanted: independence, respect, a working partnership with someone who understood her. This is sudden. We barely know each other. We know the important things. We know we can trust each other, work together, survive difficulties without falling apart. Ezra's eyes held steady conviction. We know we're both tired of living according to other people's expectations, and you'd be content with a marriage of convenience. No, intimate expectations. Ezra was quiet for a moment, something flickering across his features too quickly for Martha to interpret. I'd be content with whatever arrangement you're comfortable with. The marriage would be real in legal terms, partnership terms. Everything else would be your choice. The offer was more generous than Martha had any right to expect. A chance to claim her inheritance with a man she genuinely liked and respected, without the emotional complications that had destroyed her previous relationships. I need time to think about this. Of course, but not too much time. If we're going to do this, we should marry before traveling to Colorado. Present ourselves to the trustees as an established couple rather than recent acquaintances. How soon are you talking about? Tomorrow morning, before we leave for Denver. Reverend Morrison could perform the ceremony, and we could begin our journey as husband and wife. Tomorrow morning. Less than 24 hours to decide whether to marry a man she'd known for a week, binding her future to his in the most permanent way possible. Ezra, this is overwhelming. I know. He rose from his chair, creating space for her to think. But sometimes the best decisions are the ones that seem impossible until you make them. Think about what you really want, Martha. Not what you think you should want, but what would actually make you happy. After he left, Martha sat alone among her packed belongings, wrestling with the most important decision of her life. Marriage to Ezra would give her everything she'd thought she wanted: property, independence, respect, a partner who saw her as an equal. But it would also close the door forever on the possibility of romantic love, of being chosen for herself rather than for practical reasons. On the other hand, romantic love had been nothing but a source of pain and humiliation. Perhaps it was time to choose practical partnership over impossible dreams. As evening fell over Cedar Ridge, Martha found herself holding the wooden box containing Ezra's roses. The preserved flowers still held their beauty, but they seemed different now, less like a romantic gesture and more like a symbol of something carefully maintained rather than naturally growing. Was that what their marriage would be? Something preserved rather than alive, functional rather than flourishing? Or was she letting past disappointments blind her to the possibility that respect and understanding might grow into something deeper, given time and nurturing? The questions circled endlessly in her mind as she prepared for what might be her last night as a single woman. Tomorrow would bring either the beginning of a new life or the abandonment of everything she'd hoped to achieve. Either way, the Martha Whitfield who woke up tomorrow morning would be making choices the frightened woman of a week ago never could have imagined. That, at least, was progress worth celebrating. Martha woke before dawn on her wedding day with her decision crystallized in her mind like frost on a window, clear, sharp, and surprisingly peaceful. She would marry Ezra Stone, not for love, not for social convention, but for the practical partnership he'd offered and the independence it would secure. She dressed with careful attention, choosing her second-best dress since the blue one still bore tears from her flight into the storm. The forest green wool complemented her coloring and fit well enough to make her feel confident rather than self-conscious. If she was going to marry a man she barely knew, she would do it with dignity. The mirror reflected a woman she hardly recognized, calmer than she'd been in years, her shoulders straight with newfound resolve. This wasn't the desperate bride of her previous failed engagements, willing to accept any man who'd have her. This was a woman entering a business arrangement with clear terms and mutual benefits. A soft knock interrupted her preparations. Martha opened the door to find Elizabeth standing in the hallway, her face streaked with tears and her usual composure completely shattered. "Martha, please tell me it isn't true. Mrs. Henderson said you're marrying that mountain man this morning. But surely it's true." Martha stepped aside to let her sister enter. "Ezra proposed yesterday, and I've accepted." "Yesterday?" "Martha, you can't marry someone you've known for a week. This is madness." Elizabeth gripped her hands desperately. "What about love? What about taking time to know each other properly? What about the 3 men who took time to know me properly and decided I wasn't worth marrying?" Martha's voice was gentle but firm. "Elizabeth, I'm not looking for romance anymore. I'm looking for partnership, respect, and the chance to build something meaningful. But you're throwing your life away on a stranger. He could be anyone, a criminal, a fortune hunter, a man with terrible secrets." Elizabeth's voice rose with panic. "What do you really know about his past? His character? His intentions?" The questions hit uncomfortably close to Martha's own concerns. She did know very little about Ezra's life before he'd appeared in the mountains 5 years ago. His gentleness and honor seemed genuine, but Elizabeth was right that she was taking enormous risks based on intuition rather than evidence. "I know he saved my life when he had no obligation to do so. I know he's treated me with more respect in a week than most men have shown in years. I know he's offering me exactly what I need to claim my inheritance and build an independent life." Martha moved to the window, looking out at the town she was about to leave forever. Sometimes you have to choose between familiar disappointment and unknown possibility. "I'm choosing possibility." Elizabeth sank into the remaining chair, her face pale with shock. "I can't believe you're really doing this. Marrying a stranger and disappearing into the wilderness. What if something happens to you? What if we never see you again? Then you'll know I died trying to live according to my own choices rather than other people's expectations." Martha turned back to her sister with a sad smile. "Elizabeth, I love you dearly, but I can't stay here any longer. This town has made it clear that there's no place for me as I am. If I'm going to risk my future on something uncertain, I'd rather risk it on freedom than on trying to become acceptable to people who've already decided I'm not." Before Elizabeth could respond, another knock announced Ezra's arrival. Martha opened the door to find him dressed in his finest clothes, dark suit, white shirt. freshly trimmed beard, looking every inch the respectable gentleman, rather than the wild hermit of local legend. "Good morning," he said formally. "I've spoken with Reverend Morrison. He's agreed to perform the ceremony at 8 o'clock. So soon?" Elizabeth gasped. "Surely you could wait a few days, have proper banns read, give people time to interfere." Ezra's gaze was steady and calm. "Miss Elizabeth, I understand your concerns about your sister's welfare, but she's a grown woman capable of making her own decisions. My role is to support those decisions, not question them." The contrast between his attitude and those of Martha's previous suitors was stark. William had questioned every choice she made. Robert had wanted to reshape her personality to suit his preferences. Thomas had treated her like a problem requiring management. Ezra was the first man to suggest that her judgment might be trusted. "Martha, please." Elizabeth made one final appeal. "At least wait until you reach Colorado. Give yourself time to think clearly, away from all this pressure and uncertainty." "The pressure exists because I'm unmarried," Martha replied gently. "Marrying Ezra eliminates that pressure and gives me the legal standing to claim my inheritance." "Elizabeth, this isn't a romantic impulse. It's a practical decision that serves both our interests." Her sister looked between them with desperate eyes, clearly searching for some argument that might change Martha's mind. Finding none, she collapsed into tears of frustration and fear. Martha knelt beside Elizabeth's chair, taking her hands in a firm grip. "I need you to understand something. This isn't about running away from you or from our family. It's about running toward the life I should have chosen years ago. And I need to know that you'll support me, even if you don't understand my choices." "Of course I'll support you," Elizabeth whispered through her tears. "You're my sister. I'm so frightened for you. Then be frightened for me while believing I'm strong enough to handle whatever comes. That's the greatest gift you could give me." They embraced tightly, both understanding that this goodbye might be permanent. When they separated, Elizabeth had composed herself enough to speak clearly. "I want to attend the ceremony. If you're determined to do this, you shouldn't face it alone. Thank you. That means everything to me." Ezra had waited patiently during their emotional exchange, his expression understanding rather than impatient. Now he spoke quietly to Elizabeth. "Miss Elizabeth, I give you my word that I'll protect your sister to the best of my ability. She'll want for nothing I can provide, and she'll be free to make her own choices about how to live her life. And if she's unhappy, if this arrangement doesn't work as you both hope, then we'll face that problem honestly and find a solution that serves her interests." Ezra's voice carried absolute conviction. "I'm not marrying your sister to control her or change her. I'm marrying her to give her the freedom to become whoever she chooses to be." The simple declaration seemed to ease Elizabeth's fears slightly. She nodded slowly, accepting what she couldn't change. "Then I suppose we should proceed to the church." The ceremony was small and subdued, attended only by Elizabeth, Sarah Mitchell, and a handful of curious townspeople who'd heard rumors of the hasty wedding. Reverend Morrison performed the service with professional efficiency, though his disapproval was evident in every word. Martha found herself studying Ezra's profile as they exchanged vows, wondering what thoughts lay behind his calm expression. Was he regretting his impulsive proposal, questioning the wisdom of binding himself to a woman he barely knew? Or was he simply focused on the practical benefits of their arrangement? When asked if she took Ezra Stone as her lawfully wedded husband, Martha's voice rang out clear and strong. "I do." When Ezra made the same promise, his deep voice carried such conviction that several women in the congregation sighed romantically, clearly believing they were witnessing a love match rather than a business merger. The kiss that sealed their union was brief and chaste, a formal acknowledgement of their new legal status rather than an expression of passion. But Martha felt a strange warmth spread through her chest as Ezra's lips touched hers. Not desire exactly, but something like gratitude mixed with possibility. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Morrison intoned with the enthusiasm of a man announcing a funeral. "May God have mercy on your souls." Outside the church, well-wishers offered congratulations that ranged from genuine happiness to barely concealed gossip-mongering. Sarah Mitchell embraced Martha warmly, whispering that she thought Mr. Stone was exactly the kind of strong, steady man Martha deserved. Elizabeth maintained her composure admirably, wishing them both happiness, with only a slight tremor in her voice. Thomas Brennan appeared as they prepared to leave for the train station, his face dark with what looked like genuine anger. "This is madness, Martha. You're throwing your life away on a savage just to spite the people who tried to help you." His voice carried the frustration of a man who'd lost something he hadn't realized he wanted until it was gone. When this disaster ends in tragedy, don't expect sympathy from those who tried to save you from your own foolishness. Before Martha could respond, Ezra stepped forward with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to handling threats. His voice was deadly quiet. "Mr. Brennan, you will address my wife with respect, or you will not address her at all." The word wife seemed to hit Thomas like a physical blow. He looked between them with dawning realization that Martha was truly beyond his reach now, protected by law and by a man who clearly wouldn't tolerate insults. "Your wife?" Thomas repeated bitterly. "Well, I suppose she's got what she always wanted, a man desperate enough to marry her, regardless of her obvious shortcomings." This time Martha spoke before Ezra could respond, her voice carrying a strength that surprised even her. "Thomas, I got exactly what I wanted, a man who sees my strengths rather than my shortcomings, a man who chose me rather than settling for me." She met his eyes directly. "I'm sorry that concept is so foreign to you." The crowd that had gathered to witness their departure murmured appreciatively at her response. Thomas's face flushed red with humiliation as he realized he'd just been publicly dismissed by the woman he'd rejected. "You'll regret this," he muttered, but the threat lacked conviction. "The only thing I regret is the years I wasted thinking men like you had anything valuable to offer," Martha replied calmly. Ezra offered her his arm with formal courtesy. "Shall we go, Mrs. Stone?" "Our train won't wait, Mrs. Stone." The name settled around Martha like a new garment, unfamiliar but not uncomfortable. She took her husband's arm and walked away from Cedar Ridge without looking back, leaving behind 2 decades of disappointment and limitation. The train journey to Denver passed in companionable conversation as Martha and Ezra established the practical framework of their new relationship. They discussed ranch management, financial arrangements, and household responsibilities with the efficiency of business partners finalizing a contract. "I'll handle the livestock and heavy labor," Ezra explained as countryside rolled past their window. "You can manage the household gardens and financial records. We'll make major decisions together, but day-to-day operations should be divided according to our strengths." "That sounds reasonable. What about social obligations? If there are neighbors, community gatherings, that sort of thing. We'll present ourselves as a married couple, naturally, but there's no need for excessive displays of affection or romantic pretense." Ezra's voice was matter-of-fact. "People will accept whatever relationship we choose to show them." Martha nodded, though something in her chest tightened at his clinical approach to their marriage. She'd expected practical arrangements, but the complete absence of warmth in his planning felt almost lonely. "And living arrangements? The house, I mean. Sleeping arrangements." Ezra was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the passing landscape. "The house has multiple bedrooms, according to the property description. We can each have our own space, unless you prefer otherwise, unless she preferred otherwise." The careful phrasing suggested he was leaving the door open for intimacy without pressuring her to walk through it. Martha appreciated his consideration, even as she wondered what his own preferences might be. "That sounds practical," she agreed, though the word practical was beginning to feel like a cage around her emotions. As they approached Denver, Ezra's demeanor grew more serious. "The meeting with the trustees is tomorrow morning. They'll want to assess our marriage, my qualifications, and your capability to manage ranch property. We need to present a united front, a couple who chose each other for sound reasons and who will work together successfully." Any specific concerns I should be prepared to address? Your inexperience with ranch life, probably. Your ability to handle the isolation and physical demands. They may question whether our marriage is genuine or just a legal convenience to meet the inheritance requirements. The last concern sent anxiety spiraling through Martha's stomach. How did one prove the genuineness of a marriage that had been arranged for purely practical reasons? How do we convince them it's real when it isn't exactly? Ezra turned to study her face with uncomfortable intensity. Isn't it? We made legal vows, committed to building a life together, agreed to support each other's goals and well-being. What makes a marriage more real than that? Love, I suppose, passion, emotional connection. And how many marriages built on those foundations end in misery because the couple never learned to work together practically? Ezra's voice grew thoughtful. Maybe what we have is more honest than most romantic unions. We know exactly what we're committing to. Martha considered his words as Denver's buildings grew larger outside their window. Perhaps he was right that their practical foundation was more solid than romantic fantasy. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something essential was missing from their careful arrangements, some spark of genuine feeling that would transform partnership into something deeper. The hotel where they stayed that night reinforced the businesslike nature of their relationship. Ezra arranged for separate rooms without discussion, conducting himself with the courtesy of a traveling companion rather than a new husband. Martha found herself lying awake, wondering if this polite distance would characterize the rest of their marriage. The next morning brought the most important test of their union. The trustees, 3 distinguished gentlemen in expensive suits, received them in a lavishly appointed office that spoke of significant wealth and influence. Martha's inheritance was clearly substantial enough to warrant careful oversight. Mrs. Stone, Mr. Stone, welcome to Denver. The senior trustee, a silver-haired man named Patterson, gestured them to chairs arranged before an imposing desk. We appreciate you making the journey to finalize these arrangements. Of course, Martha replied, grateful. Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. I'm eager to claim my aunt's generous bequest. Yes, well, that's precisely what we need to discuss. Patterson consulted a thick file of documents. Your aunt's will contains specific requirements that must be satisfied before the property can be transferred. We understand you've recently married? 3 days ago, Ezra confirmed. In Cedar Ridge, Colorado Territory. Rather sudden, wasn't it? How long had you been acquainted before the wedding? Martha felt heat rise in her cheeks, but answered honestly. We met recently, but sometimes circumstances require quick decisions. Mr. Stone offered the partnership I needed to claim my inheritance, and I offered him the chance to establish himself on productive land. A partnership. The second trustee, a thin man named Caldwell, leaned forward with obvious skepticism. Mrs. Stone, your aunt required marriage because she believed a woman needed male protection and guidance on the frontier. Are you suggesting your union is merely a business arrangement? The trap was obvious. If she admitted the marriage was purely practical, they might reject it as insufficient. If she claimed romantic love, they might question the hasty timeline. Mr. Caldwell, Ezra spoke before Martha could respond. My wife and I believe that the strongest marriages are built on mutual respect, shared goals, and practical compatibility. We chose each other because we recognize those qualities in one another. And the romantic element? Patterson pressed. Surely you don't expect us to believe there's no affection between you. Ezra reached over and took Martha's hand, his fingers warm and reassuring around hers. I have great affection for my wife. I admire her courage, her intelligence, and her determination to build a meaningful life. She deserves my protection and support, which I'm honored to provide. The simple declaration sent unexpected warmth flooding through Martha's chest. He'd managed to express genuine feeling without claiming romantic love, affection earned rather than assumed, respect demonstrated rather than demanded. And you, Mrs. Stone? Patterson's keen eyes fixed on her face. What drew you to your husband? Martha looked at Ezra's strong profile, remembering his gentleness during her rescue, his willingness to defend her against criticism, his offer of partnership without conditions or demands for change. My husband is the first man who's ever seen me as I am, and chosen me anyway, she said quietly. He doesn't want to change me or manage me or improve me. He simply wants to build something together. That's a rarer gift than romantic passion, in my experience. The honesty in her voice seemed to satisfy something in Patterson's expression. He consulted his papers again before speaking. Very well. Now we must assess Mr. Stone's qualifications for managing ranch property. Your references, sir? Ezra produced a folder of documents, letters from bankers, property managers, and business associates that painted a picture of competence and reliability. Martha listened with growing amazement as the trustees questioned him about cattle management, crop rotation, water rights, and market conditions. His answers revealed knowledge she hadn't suspected, experience that went far beyond what a simple mountain hermit should possess. Impressive credentials, Mr. Stone, Caldwell acknowledged. Your background is more extensive than we expected. I've had varied experiences, Ezra replied carefully. Mountain living teaches many skills, but I've also managed property in Kansas and Missouri before coming west. There was something evasive in his response that made Martha wonder what other surprises her new husband might be concealing. But the trustees seemed satisfied with his qualifications. Moving on to practical questions about ranch operations and financial planning. After 2 hours of intensive questioning, Patterson finally leaned back in his chair with a decisive nod. Mrs. Stone, Mr. Stone, the board is prepared to approve the transfer of your inheritance. You've demonstrated both the personal commitment your aunt required and the practical capability necessary for successful ranch management. Relief flooded through Martha so intensely she felt lightheaded. Thank you. Thank you all. The property transfer will be completed within the week. You'll receive full title to the land, buildings, livestock, and monetary assets. Patterson's stern expression softened slightly. Your aunt would be pleased, I think. She always believed the right circumstances could bring out the best in people. As they left the trustee meeting, Martha felt as if she could float above the Denver streets. After years of limitations and disappointments, she finally possessed the independence she'd dreamed of, her own land, her own home, her own choices about how to live. We did it, she said to Ezra as they walked back toward their hotel. We actually convinced them. You did it, he corrected gently. Your honesty and determination convinced them. I was just supporting evidence. Martha looked up at her husband. The words still felt strange, but increasingly right, with newfound appreciation. Ezra, there's so much I don't know about you. Your experience with property management, your business connections. You could have managed a ranch anywhere. Why did you really agree to help me? Ezra was quiet for several blocks, his long strides adjusted to match her shorter ones. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible, above the street noise, maybe because you were the first person in 5 years who looked at me like I was a man worth knowing, instead of a problem to be solved, or a threat to be avoided. He glanced down at her with something that might have been vulnerability. Maybe because helping you claim your freedom felt like claiming some of my own. The confession stirred something warm and complicated in Martha's chest. Their marriage might have begun as a practical arrangement, but there were depths to it she was only beginning to understand. As they prepared to travel to her new home, she found herself genuinely curious about what kind of partnership they might build together. Not just the business arrangement they'd planned, but the relationship that might grow from spending their days working toward shared goals. For the first time since leaving Cedar Ridge, Martha felt like she was moving towards something rather than away from it. The future stretched ahead, full of possibilities she couldn't have imagined a week ago. And she was no longer facing it alone. Whatever challenges awaited them on the ranch, she would meet them as a married woman with legal rights, financial independence, and a partner who had chosen to share her journey. It wasn't the romantic dream she'd once cherished, but it was something potentially more valuable, a foundation solid enough to build whatever kind of life they decided they wanted. As the train carried them toward Colorado and her inheritance, Martha Stone settled back in her seat with a sense of quiet satisfaction. She'd claimed her freedom, secured her future, and gained a husband who respected her autonomy. Now it remained to be seen what they could create together with such promising raw materials. The train pulled into Milfield, Colorado, just as the sun reached its zenith, casting harsh shadows across a frontier town that looked barely more substantial than the wooden platforms that marked its existence. Martha stepped onto the depot platform with a mixture of excitement and trepidation, her traveling dress dusty from 3 days of rail travel, but her spirits high with anticipation. "Not much to look at, is it?" Ezra observed, shouldering their luggage with practiced ease. Martha surveyed the collection of weathered buildings clustered around the depot: a general store, a saloon, a hotel that had seen better days, and perhaps a dozen houses scattered along dirt streets. It was smaller and rougher than Cedar Ridge, but something about its raw honesty appealed to her. "It's perfect," she said, surprising them both with her certainty. "No one here knows Martha Whitfield, the town spinster. They only know Martha Stone, the woman who owns the largest ranch in the county." Ezra's rare smile transformed his features. "Mrs. Stone it is, then. Shall we go see your property?" The livery stable owner, a grizzled man named Murphy, looked them over with the frank assessment of someone accustomed to judging character quickly. When Ezra explained they needed transportation to the Whitfield ranch, Murphy's weathered face broke into a grin. "So you're Clara's niece. Heard someone was finally coming to claim that place. Fine woman, your aunt. Took no nonsense from anyone and ran that ranch better than most men could." He eyed Ezra appraisingly. "Hope you're ready for hard work, mister. That property's been sitting empty for near 6 months. They rented a sturdy wagon and team for the 10-mile journey to the ranch, following a dirt road that wound through rolling grassland, dotted with cattle and bordered by distant mountains. The landscape was vast and open in a way that made Martha feel simultaneously insignificant and liberated. So much space that a person could disappear into it or expand to fill it, depending on their nature. "There," Ezra pointed ahead to where buildings became visible against a backdrop of cottonwood trees. "That must be it." Martha's first glimpse of her inheritance took her breath away. The house was larger than she'd expected. A solid 2-story structure with a wraparound porch and dormant flower beds that suggested former care and attention. Outbuildings clustered nearby: a barn, stables, a chicken coop, and several smaller structures whose purposes she could only guess at. But it was the setting that truly captured her imagination. The house sat on a slight rise, overlooking a valley, where a stream meandered through grassland that stretched to the horizon. Mountains formed a protective barrier in the distance, their peaks still touched with snow, despite the warming weather. The vastness was both intimidating and exhilarating, space enough for dreams she hadn't dared to harbor in the confines of Cedar Ridge. "It's beautiful," she whispered, then laughed at the inadequacy of the word. "It's magnificent." They drove up the winding track to the house, noting signs of neglect that 6 months of abandonment had created. Fences needed repair, gardens were overgrown with weeds, and several broken shutters hung at odd angles. But the basic structures appeared sound, and Martha could envision what the place would look like with care and attention. Ezra helped her down from the wagon, and for a moment they stood together in front of the house that would be their home. The silence was profound. No traffic, no neighbors arguing, no church bells marking the hours. Just wind through grass and the distant lowing of cattle. "Are you ready?" Ezra asked, producing the keys the lawyers had provided. Martha nodded, though her heart was racing with nervousness. This moment would define the rest of her life, either the beginning of the independence she'd dreamed of, or the start of a mistake too large to undo. The front door opened onto a spacious parlor, furnished with sturdy, practical pieces that spoke of comfort rather than ostentation. Windows on 3 sides filled the room with light, and a stone fireplace dominated the far wall. Everything was dusty and smelled of disuse, but Martha could feel the potential warmth waiting to be restored. They moved through the house room by room, Ezra noting structural details, while Martha absorbed the feeling of space and possibility. The kitchen was well equipped with a large stove and ample workspace. Upstairs, 4 bedrooms offered privacy and comfort, while a study lined with empty bookshelves awaited new occupants. "Your aunt built well," Ezra observed, testing a window frame for soundness. "Good materials, solid construction. This place will last for generations with proper maintenance." Martha wandered to the master bedroom's window, which overlooked the valley and stream. Afternoon light painted the grassland gold and green, and she could see cattle moving slowly across the distant pastures. Her cattle now on her land in her valley. "Ezra," she said softly, "I think I'm terrified." He joined her at the window, his large frame filling the space beside her. "Of what?" "Of failing. Of discovering I'm not strong enough or smart enough to make this work." Martha's voice was barely audible. "Of proving that all those people who said I was foolish were right. And what if you succeed? What if you discover you're stronger and more capable than anyone ever imagined?" Ezra's voice carried the same gentle conviction she'd heard before. "What if you prove that the only thing holding you back was other people's limited vision of what you could be?" Before Martha could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the front window. A group of riders was making its way up the track to the house, 5 men on horseback, moving with the purposeful urgency that suggested serious business. "Neighbors coming to welcome us?" Martha asked hopefully. Ezra's expression had grown grim as he studied the approaching riders. "I don't think so." "Stay behind me, Martha. Something about this doesn't feel right." They went downstairs to meet their unexpected visitors, emerging onto the front porch as the riders dismounted in the yard. The men were rough-looking, armed with rifle and pistol, their clothes and demeanor suggesting they were more familiar with trouble than hospitality. The leader, a stocky man with graying hair and cold eyes, stepped forward with a smile that didn't reach his face. "Well, well, you must be the new owners. Name's Garrett. I run cattle in these parts." His gaze swept over Martha with obvious calculation before fixing on Ezra. "Heard Clara's property finally got claimed. Hope you folks are planning to be neighborly." "Neighborly in what way, Mr. Garrett?" Ezra's voice was carefully neutral, but Martha could feel tension radiating from him like heat from a stove. "Oh, the usual courtesies. Sharing water rights, cooperating on roundups, that sort of thing." Garrett's smile widened. "Course. Some arrangements work better than others. Clara now, she was a mite stubborn about certain business practices. Hope her niece here will be more reasonable." The threat underlying his words was unmistakable. Martha felt her stomach clench with anxiety, but anger was stronger than fear. She stepped forward before Ezra could stop her. "Mr. Garrett, I'm not sure what arrangements you had with my aunt, but I'm quite capable of managing my own property according to my own judgment." "Is that so?" Garrett's eyes glittered with something unpleasant. "Well, Mrs. Stone," Martha replied firmly. "Mrs. Ezra Stone. Mrs. Stone. See, the thing is, your aunt's stubbornness caused considerable inconvenience for those of us trying to make a living in this valley. Water disputes, boundary disagreements, that sort of thing. Would be a shame if similar problems arose with new management." "What kind of problems?" Ezra asked, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Oh, cattle wandering onto the wrong property, fences getting damaged, water sources getting fouled. Accidents happen on the frontier, you understand. Especially when folks don't have proper protection." The man's meaning was crystal clear. They were being asked to pay for protection from trouble that would be caused by the very people offering to prevent it. Martha had heard of such practices in the wild territories, but experiencing it firsthand was both frightening and infuriating. "I think you gentlemen should leave," she said, proud that her voice remained steady. "We have unpacking to do." Garrett's expression hardened. "Mrs. Stone, I don't think you understand the situation here. This is rough country, dangerous for folks who don't know how to handle themselves. A woman like you, well, accidents can happen. Would hate to see anything unfortunate occur just because of a misunderstanding." The threat was no longer veiled. Martha felt Ezra tense beside her, and suddenly the peaceful valley seemed menacing rather than welcoming. She'd claimed her independence only to discover that freedom required the strength to defend it. "Gentlemen," Ezra spoke with deadly quiet, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. My wife owns this property legally and completely. Any interference with her peaceful enjoyment of that property would be met with appropriate response. And what kind of response would that be?" One of the other riders called out, his hand moving toward his weapon, the kind that ensures such interference doesn't happen twice. The simple statement carried such conviction that even Garrett seemed to reassess the situation. He looked between Martha and Ezra with calculating eyes, clearly trying to determine if they represented easy targets or potential threats. "Well now, no need for unpleasantness. We're just being neighborly, offering to help newcomers understand how things work around here." Garrett remounted his horse with fluid grace. "But maybe you folks need some time to settle in, think things over. We'll check back in a few days, see if you've reconsidered our offer." As the riders departed, Martha felt her knees go weak with reaction. The confrontation had lasted only minutes, but it had fundamentally changed her understanding of the challenges she faced. This wasn't just about proving she could manage a ranch. It was about proving she had the strength to fight for the right to try. "Will they be back?" she asked Ezra. "Count on it. Men like that don't give up easy when they smell weakness." Ezra's expression was grimmer than she'd ever seen it. "Martha, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Are you prepared to fight for this place? Not just work hard or endure hardship, actually fight people who want to take it from you?" Martha looked out over the valley that was supposed to represent her freedom, now shadowed by the threat of violence and intimidation. The easy answer would be to sell the property and return to a safer, more conventional life. But she'd made too many compromises already, accepted too many limitations in the name of safety and propriety. "Yes," she said simply, "I'm prepared to fight." Ezra studied her face for a long moment, then nodded with satisfaction. "Good, because that's what it's going to take to keep this place." His expression grew thoughtful. "Martha, there are things about my past I haven't told you, things that might be useful in the coming confrontation." "What kind of things?" "The kind that explain why I know more about property management and business than a simple mountain hermit should. The kind that might give us an advantage against men who think a woman and a stranger will be easy to intimidate." Before Martha could ask for details, Ezra was already moving toward their supplies. His demeanor transformed from thoughtful husband to something that looked distinctly military. "First thing we need to do is secure this place properly. Then we'll send some telegrams, call in some favors." He looked back at her with something that might have been pride. "Mrs. Stone, I think Garrett and his friends are about to discover they picked the wrong ranch to threaten." The next 3 days transformed Martha's understanding of the man she'd married. The gentle mountain hermit who'd rescued her from a storm revealed depths she'd never suspected, military precision in his movements, tactical thinking in his planning, and connections that reached far beyond what a simple frontier rancher should possess. "You were a soldier," Martha said on the second evening as she watched Ezra clean weapons she hadn't known he carried. "It wasn't a question, officer. Union Army, then Territorial Marshals." Ezra's hands moved with practiced efficiency over the rifle components. "Spent 15 years dealing with men like Garrett and his crew. I know their methods, their weaknesses, their fears. Is that why you really came west? Running from that life?" Ezra paused in his work, his expression growing distant. "Running from the guilt of leaving my family unprotected while I played soldier. Sarah died believing I valued duty more than her safety. Took me 5 years to realize that running away wasn't honoring her memory. It was continuing to fail her." The raw honesty in his confession made Martha's chest tighten with sympathy. "And helping me claim this ranch is the first useful thing I've done since she died. First time I've felt like the man she married rather than the coward who survived her." Ezra met Martha's eyes directly. "This fight isn't just about your property, Martha. It's about proving I can still protect someone who matters, someone who matters." The words sent warmth flooding through Martha's body, followed immediately by the practical realization that their marriage was about to be tested in ways she'd never imagined. What exactly are we up against? Garrett runs a loose confederation of smaller ranchers and drifters. They've been pressuring independent property owners to sell out or pay protection money. Your aunt refused both options, which is probably why the harassment escalated. Ezra reassembled his rifle with mechanical precision. They're counting on intimidation working where outright force might bring unwanted attention from territorial authorities. And if intimidation doesn't work, then they'll escalate until we surrender or fight back decisively enough to convince them we're more trouble than we're worth. Martha absorbed this information while preparing their simple dinner over the wood stove. The domestic activity felt surreal given the circumstances, playing house while preparing for what amounted to a small war. I sent telegrams today, Ezra continued. Called in some favors from men who owe me from the old days. We'll have help if this gets serious. What kind of help? The kind that knows how to handle range wars and corrupt local officials. Ezra's smile was grim. Garrett may think he's dealing with helpless newcomers, but he's about to discover he's made a very expensive mistake. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a rider approaching fast. Martha tensed, but Ezra moved to the window with calm purpose. Single rider coming hard. Probably a messenger rather than a threat. The visitor proved to be a young man from town, his face flushed with urgency and exertion. Mrs. Stone? Mr. Stone? Name's Billy Henderson from Murphy's stable. Got an urgent message for you. Ezra accepted the folded paper, reading it quickly before his expression darkened. When did this arrive? About an hour ago. Murphy said to bring it out immediate, no matter the hour. After Billy left, Ezra handed Martha the telegram. The message was brief but chilling. Garrett has county sheriff in pocket. Stop warrant being prepared for your arrest. Stop charges of cattle theft and property destruction. Stop move now or face jail. Stop signed Marshall Collins. They're going to have me arrested on false charges, Martha said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the fear clawing at her stomach. It's a common tactic. Get you locked up, then force a property sale to pay legal expenses and restitution for crimes you didn't commit. Ezra was already moving toward their supplies. We need to be gone before dawn. Find somewhere safe while we sort this out properly. No. The word came out with such conviction that it surprised them both. No, I won't run. Martha, this isn't about courage. It's about tactics. Sometimes strategic retreat is exactly what they want. They want me to run so they can claim I abandoned the property or fled prosecution. Martha stood straighter, feeling something steel-like forming in her spine. I spent 28 years running from confrontation, accepting other people's judgment of my worth. I won't start my new life the same way. Ezra studied her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed. You understand what you're choosing? If we stay and fight, people might get hurt. This could turn bloody. If we run, I lose everything I've worked to gain. My property, my independence, my self-respect. Martha met his gaze without flinching. I'd rather fight and lose than surrender without trying. Something shifted in Ezra's expression, surprise giving way to something that looked like admiration. All right then. We make our stand here, but we do it smart, not brave. He moved to the kitchen table, spreading out papers that proved to be detailed maps and legal documents. First, we establish that our ownership is unquestionable. No technicalities they can exploit. Second, we document every threat and illegal action they've taken. Third, we ensure that any confrontation happens with witnesses and proper legal authority present. How do we manage that last part if the sheriff is working with them? We bring in higher authority. Federal marshals, territorial judges, people who outrank corrupt local officials. Ezra's smile was sharp with anticipation. Garrett's about to learn that some people have connections he can't buy or intimidate. They worked through the night, preparing legal documents, securing evidence, and fortifying the house as best they could with available materials. By dawn, Martha felt like a different person than the woman who'd fled Cedar Ridge a week ago. That woman had been shaped by fear and limitation. This woman was preparing to fight for everything she valued. The confrontation came with the morning sun. A larger group of riders approached the house, not just Garrett's men, but official-looking figures, including someone wearing a badge that caught the early light. "That's Sheriff Morrison," Ezra observed through the window. "And those 3 men with him aren't local. Professional gunmen, from the look of them." Martha's mouth went dry, but her resolve remained firm. "What's the plan?" "We go out together, present a united front, and force them to explain their actions in front of witnesses." Ezra checked his weapons one final time. "Remember, we're the legitimate property owners here. They're the ones acting outside the law." They emerged onto the porch to face a semicircle of mounted men, weapons clearly visible and intentions unmistakable. Sheriff Morrison, a thin man with nervous eyes, held an official-looking document. "Mrs. Stone, Mr. Stone, I'm afraid I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of cattle theft and destruction of property." His voice lacked conviction, suggesting he knew the charges were fabricated. "On whose complaint, Sheriff?" Martha asked, proud that her voice remained steady. "Mr. Garrett here has sworn that you've been running his cattle off their rightful grazing land and destroying fence lines." "I see. And when exactly did these alleged crimes occur?" Ezra's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to legal proceedings. Morrison consulted his papers nervously. "Various times over the past, several weeks. Interesting, since we only arrived 3 days ago and haven't left the immediate vicinity of this house." Martha stepped forward slightly. "Sheriff, are you certain you want to proceed with obviously false charges?" "The warrant is legal and proper," Garrett interjected, though his eyes kept shifting to scan the horizon. "Justice needs to be served." "Justice indeed," came a new voice from behind the house. Everyone turned to see 3 riders emerging from the tree line, men in official badges and federal authority written in their bearing. The leader, a gray-haired man with steel in his eyes, addressed the group with crisp authority. "I'm Marshal Collins, Territorial Justice Department. Sheriff Morrison, you're under arrest for corruption and conspiracy. Mr. Garrett, you and your associates will come with us for questioning regarding numerous complaints of intimidation and extortion." The reversal was so sudden and complete that Martha felt momentarily dizzy. Garrett's face went through a series of expressions: shock, rage, fear, before settling on defeated resignation. "This ain't over," he called to Martha as the federal marshals efficiently disarmed and arrested the local conspirators. "You can't protect this place forever." "I don't need to protect it forever," Martha replied with newfound confidence. "I just need to protect it long enough for honest law enforcement to do its job." As the arrested men were led away, Marshal Collins approached the porch with something that might have been a smile. "Mrs. Stone." "Mr. Stone, your husband's telegram reached us at exactly the right time. We've been building a case against Garrett's operation for months, but needed witnesses willing to stand up to intimidation." "Happy to help," Ezra replied. "Though I'm curious how you managed to arrive so conveniently," Collins chuckled. "We've been camped in those hills for 2 days, waiting to see how this played out. Your telegram told us you were prepared to make a stand, and we needed to see Garrett's crew in action to complete our case." His expression grew serious. "Mrs. Stone, your courage in refusing to run made this arrest possible. A lot of honest ranchers in this territory owe you a debt of gratitude." Martha felt a flush of pride at the marshal's words, but more importantly, she felt the deep satisfaction of having made the right choice. Standing and fighting had been risky, but surrender would have guaranteed failure. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you get to live peacefully on your property while Garrett and his associates face federal prosecution for extortion, intimidation, and corruption of local officials." Collins tipped his hat respectfully. "Mrs. Stone, it's been a pleasure meeting a woman with the backbone to stand up to bullies. This territory needs more folks like you." As the law enforcement officers departed with their prisoners, Martha and Ezra stood alone in the sudden quiet of their valley. The morning sun painted everything gold and peaceful, as if the violent confrontation had been a bad dream rather than a test of everything they'd committed to building together. "Well," Martha said finally, "that was terrifying." "And magnificent," Ezra added, turning to study her face with an expression she couldn't quite read. Martha, do you realize what you just did? You faced down armed criminals, corrupt officials, and the possibility of losing everything you'd worked for. And you never wavered. I had help. I had you. I provided backup. The courage was entirely yours. Ezra's voice carried something new, not just respect, but something warmer and deeper. The woman who just stared down Garrett's threats bears no resemblance to the frightened person I found in that storm a week ago. Martha considered his words, realizing he was right. The woman who'd fled into the mountains to escape humiliation had been replaced by someone who could face genuine danger without flinching. The transformation felt as dramatic as shedding an old skin. "I suppose I've changed," she said. "Quietly, you've become who you always were, underneath the fear and other people's expectations." Ezra moved closer, his large frame somehow less intimidating than comforting now. "Martha, I need to tell you something I should have said before we married." The serious tone in his voice made her heart race with anxiety. "What is it?" "I didn't propose to you just for practical reasons. I didn't marry you just to help you claim your inheritance." Ezra's dark eyes held hers with unwavering intensity. "I married you because somewhere between finding you in that storm and watching you choose courage over safety, I realized I was falling in love with you." The confession hit Martha like a physical blow. She stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she'd heard. "But you said we agreed this was a practical arrangement." "I lied to you and to myself." Ezra's voice was rough with emotion. "I told myself I was helping you out of duty because it was easier than admitting I was falling for a woman brave enough to choose freedom over security. Easier than risking my heart again after losing Sarah." Martha's mind reeled with the implications of his confession. Their entire marriage had been built on what she'd thought was mutual emotional distance, practical partnership without the complications of romance. Now he was suggesting that foundation had been false from the beginning. "You love me?" The words came out as barely a whisper. "I love your courage, your kindness, your determination to live according to your own values despite the cost." Ezra's hands clenched at his sides as if he were forcing himself not to reach for her. "I love the way you see possibilities where others see problems. I love the woman who just risked everything to defend her right to choose her own life." The declaration should have filled Martha with joy, but instead she felt a complicated mixture of happiness and something that might have been anger. "Why didn't you tell me? Why let me think this was just business?" "Because I was a coward. Because I thought it was safer to pretend I didn't care than to risk having my feelings rejected." Ezra's expression was raw with vulnerability. "Because I've spent 5 years believing I didn't deserve to love anyone again after failing to protect my family. And now I've watched you choose to fight for what matters to you, and I realize I want to do the same." Ezra took a step closer, his voice dropping to barely audible. "Martha, I'm choosing to fight for the chance that you might feel something for me beyond grateful partnership. I'm choosing to risk rejection rather than live with regret." Martha stared at him, her heart pounding so hard she could barely think. The practical marriage she'd agreed to was dissolving before her eyes, replaced by something far more dangerous and infinitely more precious. He was offering her real love, genuine emotional connection, the romantic partnership she'd stopped believing was possible. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say whatever's true." "I can handle rejection, Martha. What I can't handle is pretending we're nothing more than business partners when I feel the way I do about you." The honesty in his confession broke something loose in Martha's chest. All the careful wall she'd built around her heart, all the protective distance she'd maintained to avoid more disappointment. Looking at Ezra's face, seeing the vulnerability he was choosing to show her, she realized that somewhere along the way, she'd stopped thinking of him as a convenient husband and started thinking of him as the man she wanted to spend her life with. "I think," she said slowly, testing the words as she spoke them, "I think I've been falling in love with you too. I just didn't dare admit it even to myself." The relief that flooded Ezra's features was beautiful to see. "Really? Really?" The man who saved me from the storm, who defended my choices, who stood beside me against armed criminals. How could I not love him? Martha felt tears starting in her eyes. I think I started loving you the moment you told me I deserved better treatment than I was receiving. No one had ever said that to me before. Martha. Her name was a prayer on his lips as he finally closed the distance between them, his large hands cupping her face with infinite gentleness. May I kiss my wife? Really kiss her, the way a man kisses a woman he loves. Instead of answering with words, Martha rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his, pouring into the kiss all the feelings she'd been afraid to acknowledge. His response was immediate and overwhelming, not the chaste peck of their wedding ceremony, but a real kiss that spoke of desire, commitment, and the promise of deeper intimacy to come. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard and smiling like fools. So, Martha said, her voice slightly unsteady, I suppose this changes our living arrangements. If you want it to, Ezra replied carefully. We can take things as slowly as you need. There's no pressure. Ezra Stone, Martha interrupted with a laugh. We just faced down armed criminals together. I think we can handle sharing a bedroom. His answering grin was pure joy. In that case, Mrs. Stone, welcome to your new life. All of it, the ranch, the freedom, and the husband who loves you exactly as you are. As they stood together on the porch of their home, looking out over the valley that belonged to them now in every sense, Martha felt a deep contentment she'd never experienced before. She claimed her inheritance, defended her choices, and discovered that the practical marriage she'd settled for was actually the love story she'd stopped believing in. The future stretched ahead full of possibilities, working the ranch together, building a life based on mutual respect and genuine affection, proving that sometimes the most practical choice was also the most romantic one. Martha Stone was finally, completely and absolutely free to be herself. And herself, it turned out, was a woman brave enough to fight for what she wanted, and fortunate enough to marry a man who loved her for exactly that courage. The mountains watched over their valley with ancient patience, keeping guard over two people who'd found in each other not just partnership, but the kind of love that made all risks worthwhile. 6 months later, Martha Stone stood on her front porch, watching the sun rise over her valley, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that steamed in the crisp morning air. The mountains stood sentinel in the distance, their peaks touched with early snow that reminded her of the storm that had changed her life so completely. The ranch had flourished under their joint management. Fences had been repaired, gardens planted and harvested, cattle moved to better pastures. The house itself had been transformed from a dusty shell into a warm home filled with books, comfortable furniture, and the quiet contentment of two people who'd learned to build something beautiful together. Morning. Beautiful. Ezra's voice came from behind her, followed by his arms encircling her waist as he pulled her back against his chest. The gesture was familiar now, natural as breathing, but it still sent warmth flooding through her body. Morning yourself. Handsome. Martha leaned into his embrace, marveling at how right it felt to be held this way. Sleep well? Better than I have in years. Better than I thought I'd ever sleep again. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. Any regrets about the choice you made? It was a question he asked periodically, not from insecurity, but from genuine concern for her happiness. Martha smiled, remembering the frightened woman who'd fled Cedar Ridge 6 months ago. Not a single one. My only regret is that it took me so long to find the courage to tell you how I felt. Ezra's arms tightened around her slightly. Though I suppose we both needed time to become the people who could handle this kind of love. Love. The word still sent little thrills through Martha's heart, even after months of hearing it regularly. Not the desperate, grasping emotion she'd mistaken for love in her younger years, but something deeper and more sustainable. Partnership seasoned with passion, respect deepened by genuine affection. Speaking of love, Martha said, turning in his arms to face him, I have something to tell you. Ezra's expression grew attentive. What is it? I'm expecting. The words came out simply, without drama or elaborate build-up. Dr. Harrison confirmed it yesterday when he came out to check on the widow Peterson. For a moment, Ezra's face went completely blank. Then a smile spread across his features like sunrise, transforming him from serious rancher to delighted husband. A baby. We're having a baby. In about 7 months, according to the doctor. Martha watched his face carefully, looking for any sign of the fear or reluctance that might accompany such news. Are you happy about it? Instead of answering with words, Ezra lifted her off her feet and spun her around the porch, both of them laughing like children. When he set her down, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. Happy doesn't begin to cover it. Terrified, elated, grateful, he cupped her face in his hands. Martha, you've given me everything I thought I'd lost forever. A home, a purpose, love, and now the chance to be a father again. A better father this time, Martha said softly. Present, protective, but not consumed by guilt over things beyond your control. A better man, thanks to you. Ezra's thumb traced her cheekbone with infinite gentleness. Our child will grow up knowing they're wanted, valued, and free to become whoever they choose to be. As they stood together planning their expanding future, the sound of approaching riders drew their attention to the road. Martha tensed automatically, old habits from their confrontation with Garrett's men, but relaxed when she recognized the familiar figures. Elizabeth, Martha called out, rushing down from the porch to embrace her sister. What are you doing here? How did you manage the journey? Elizabeth laughed as she dismounted from her horse, her travel clothes dusty but her face bright with excitement. James arranged for me to travel with a freight wagon heading this direction. I couldn't stand not seeing how you were settling in. She looked around the valley with obvious amazement. Martha, this place is incredible, isn't it? Martha felt proud warmth spreading through her chest as she showed off her domain. Come inside, you must be exhausted. We have so much to catch up on. Over dinner, Elizabeth shared news from Cedar Ridge, marriages and births, business developments, and the general gossip that seemed so petty now compared to the real challenges Martha had learned to face. Thomas Brennan married the Miller girl last month, Elizabeth reported with obvious reluctance. Rather a hasty courtship, people said. I hope they'll be happy, Martha replied, and meant it. Her anger toward Thomas had faded into indifference months ago. Everyone deserves the chance to find the right person for them. Speaking of which, Elizabeth's eyes moved between Martha and Ezra with barely contained curiosity. You two seem quite content together. Martha and Ezra exchanged amused glances. Their obvious happiness was probably confusing to someone who'd expected a marriage of convenience to remain coldly practical. We are, Martha confirmed simply. More than content. We're genuinely happy, but I thought when you left you said this was a business arrangement. It was. And then it became something more. Ezra reached over to take Martha's hand, their fingers intertwining naturally. Sometimes the best partnerships grow into the deepest love stories. Elizabeth stared at their joined hands, then at their faces, clearly trying to reconcile this warm intimacy with her memories of Martha's previous romantic disasters. You're really in love, both of you. Completely, ridiculously, permanently in love, Martha confirmed with a laugh. I know it's not what anyone expected, least of all us. But here we are, and you're having a baby, Elizabeth said softly. Having noticed the subtle signs that pregnancy brought, how did you— Never mind. You always were too observant for your own good. Martha smiled at her sister's knowing expression. Yes, we're expecting. In the spring. Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears of pure joy. Oh, Martha, I'm so happy for you. So very, very happy. They talked late into the evening, sharing stories and dreams, while Ezra carved quietly by the fireplace, not crosses now, but a cradle rocker for the child who would soon fill their home with new purpose. The scene felt perfect in its simple domesticity. 3 people who'd learned to value love and family above social conventions. The next morning, as Elizabeth prepared to return to Cedar Ridge, she pulled Martha aside for a private conversation. I owe you an apology, she said quietly. When you left with Ezra, I thought you were making a terrible mistake. I was so afraid you'd be hurt or taken advantage of. You were trying to protect me. I understood that, even when I disagreed with your methods. But you were right to choose as you did. I can see it in your face, in the way you carry yourself. You're truly happy for the first time in your adult life. Elizabeth squeezed Martha's hands. I'm proud of you for having the courage to claim what you needed, even when it seemed impossible. Thank you. That means everything to me. Will you write? Let me know how the baby is, how the ranch is doing. Of course. And you're welcome here any time. This will always be your home too, Elizabeth. As her sister's wagon disappeared down the road toward town, Martha felt a deep sense of completion settling over her. She'd maintained the family connections that mattered while building a new life according to her own values. The frightened woman who'd fled Cedar Ridge was truly gone, replaced by someone confident enough to love and be loved without reservation. Any regrets about seeing her go? Ezra asked, joining her in the yard. None. I love Elizabeth dearly, but this is my life now. Our life? Martha gestured toward the house, the valley, the cattle grazing peacefully in the distance. Everything I ever wanted without knowing I wanted it. And what do you want now? For the future, I mean. Martha considered the question, thinking about the child growing within her. The ranch that would need expanding as their family grew. The community they were slowly becoming part of as neighbors learned to trust and respect them. I want to raise our children to be strong, kind, and free to choose their own paths. I want to build this ranch into something we can be proud of. I want to grow old with you, watching grandchildren play in this valley. She paused, then smiled. And I want to prove that the best love stories sometimes begin with the most practical arrangements. Ezra's answering smile was full of promise. I think we can manage all of that. As autumn deepened into winter, Martha found herself often thinking about the completed quilt that now covered their marriage bed, the one she'd started as a symbol of piecing together a new life and finished as a celebration of love found in unexpected places. Each patch represented a choice made, a challenge faced, a dream realized, like the quilt. Their marriage had been constructed from practical pieces that had somehow combined into something beautiful and warm. The woman who'd been rejected 3 times for being too much trouble had found a man who saw her supposed flaws as evidence of strength. The mountain hermit who'd buried himself in grief had discovered that love could bloom again when nurtured by courage rather than desperation. Winter storms might come, as they always did in the mountains. There would be challenges to face, problems to solve, difficulties that would test their partnership and commitment. But Martha faced the future without fear, secure in the knowledge that she'd claimed not just property and independence, but the rarest treasure of all, a love that saw and celebrated her exactly as she was. Standing on her porch as snow began to fall over their valley, Martha Stone smiled at the realization that sometimes the best things in life came disguised as practical necessities. She'd married for an inheritance and discovered a fortune she'd never known she was seeking. The mountains kept their eternal watch over 2 people who'd learned that the greatest courage was not in fighting external enemies, but in risking their hearts on the possibility that they deserved to be loved completely, without conditions or changes required. In the end, that was the most valuable inheritance of all, the knowledge that true love was worth every risk, every fight, every moment of fear that preceded the joy of finding someone brave enough to build a life together based on respect, partnership, and the radical notion that everyone deserved to be chosen for exactly who they were. Martha had finally found her place in the world, and it was here, in the arms of a man who loved her courage, on land that rewarded her determination, surrounded by the endless possibilities that came with true freedom. The future stretched ahead bright with promise, and she was ready for all of it.